All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar.
Here.
Councilmember Dabala.
Here.
Councilmember Costick.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith. Here. Councilmember Searcy.
Here.
All right, and so welcome everyone to our council meeting this evening. There are no changes to our agenda tonight, and before we dig into our meeting, the first thing we're going to do is recognize our committees and our volunteers. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm going to ask if we have one of the microphones available. All right, so tonight is a very special night. We do this once a year, but I will say that our appreciation to all our committees is a year-round thing because each of you work very hard and actually help us and our city staff do the work of on behalf of the city. And so what we're going to do is we'd like to, I'm going to call the name of the committee. If you serve on that committee, will you please come up here for a moment, and then we're going to take a group picture. We have a number of committees. If you did not get your certificate, Irma has them somewhere here, over there, and you can get it. Please pick up your certificate because I did sign every single one of them. And it just reinforced for me how many amazing, wonderful volunteers we have in the city on our committees. So first, I'd like to invite our Arts and Humanities Committee to come up, then our Board of Elections, our Commission on Landlord-Tenant Affairs, the Commemoration Commission.
You want them up on the...
Yeah, come up here.
Use the steps, please. Oh.
Yeah. No, that was very elegantly done. The Committee on the Environment, our Emergency Preparedness Committee, the Ethics Commission, the Facade Advisory Board, the Grants Review Committee, the Noise Control Board, the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee, the Police Employees Retirement Plan Committee, the Recreation Committee, the Safe Roadways Committee, which will soon be renamed, the Tree Commission, our Youth Council, and last but not least, our Chiefs Advisory Board. So everyone, please come up, and I invite the council to come and let's take a picture. Is this working? All right. Let's see if everyone, we might want to take a step back maybe.
No accidents.
Yeah, no accidents.
Right, do you want to assume our
All right. All right. Are we? No, we could do two. Those of us who are shorter can do, yeah. All right. And I did forget, in addition to our standing committees, we also have ad hoc committees, and we had our Legal Services Advisory Group. There's also here. So, okay, can we move this way? All right, everyone, move this way. I feel like I'm at a wedding. All right, terrific. And so this evening, if everyone can just wait for 1 minute, we have, we want to recognize two particular very special volunteers, Elliot and Kieran, who are graduating this year from high school. And they serve on our youth council. And in particular, I just want to say thank you to both of them. We just started the youth council. This is the second year. And for anyone who knows, serving on a committee is a lot of work. And it's particularly a lot of work when it's new. And you're figuring out how a committee is going to work, how it's going to work with the staff and with the city council. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for doing an amazing job. We are going to miss you, but you've also left such a great foundation. And I know the youth council is going to thrive because of you. So good luck in college. And I know you're not going far, Karen. And Elliot, you will come back and visit. So one more time, we just give a round of applause to our wonderful committees. Now you can all go sit down.
Please, like, no, yes. We don't have a risk management committee, but if we did.
All right. All right. As I was saying, we have no changes to our agenda this evening. Looking at future agenda items, next week, Wednesday, May 22nd, our voting session will be the first reading ordinance reestablishing the Safe Roadways Committee as the complete Safe Streets Committee. We have a single reading ordinance awarding a contract for tree planting. Our work sessions will be the closure of one lane of Laurel Avenue, a contract for restoration of the surface of the community center pedestrian bridge, and FY20 budget process review. On Wednesday, May 29th, the City Council will not have its regular meeting. We'll be taking off that Wednesday. We'll resume our regular meetings on Wednesday, June 5th. This meeting will actually be at the Rec Center on New Hampshire Avenue. So remember, June 5th, 7:30 meeting at the Rec Center. We have two very important proclamations that evening for Immigrant Heritage Month and Gun Violence Awareness Day proclamation, reminding all my colleagues to remember to wear orange that night. Our voting session that evening will be the second reading ordinance reestablishing the Safe Roadways Committee as the complete Safe Streets Committee. We'll have a single reading ordinance awarding a contract for surface restoration of the community center pedestrian bridge. Our work sessions include presentation and discussion of the community grant award recommendations and presentation and discussion of the Board of Elections recommendations for city charter and code amendments. Then on Wednesday, June 12th, our city council meeting will be back here starting at 7:30. We'll have a presentation and public hearing of small cell wireless regulations and two work sessions, one on housing and economic development strategic plan update and committee appointments. In addition, I know people have been very interested in additional work sessions that we will have regarding the budget process, tax rebates. As a reminder, next week we will have a review of how our budget process worked this year, things that went well and things we want to improve for next year. In July, we will be taking up the tax rebate issue, and we will be scheduling other work sessions over the summer and the early fall on additional items that have come up. So I think with that, we will now move to public comments on voting items. The first one is the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 tax rate. Any public comments on that? Mr. Navari.
Okay. David Navari, 7116 Sycamore. This is a formal request to the City Council for funding. I need a flap jacket and a bulletproof vest because somehow my name got distributed around the Penn listserv associated with a simple calculation of tax increase, mathematically correct, factually correct number, a real simple number, and it was called deceptive. So that's a pretty rough crowd over there. I'm really happy I live over on Sycamore where people are nicer. I'm going to blame Peter for that. So that's first. I need some funding for that, and then second, I want to formally invite our mayor over to the Sycamore, the dinner we're having, the rotating dinner. We're having appetizers at our house on Saturday, and my mother-in-law's coming, and I told her I rub elbows with a lot of powerful people, so I'd appreciate you showing up. So that's number two. Number three, I'm totally confused by this. You guys have talked about a tax rate increase that is about three something percent over. I don't know what it is, but something about the real estate taxes going up three something percent. And I saw some email exchanges that Jason had and different people had, but that seems to be twice the inflation rate. So I know we've talked about ECI, and I know there's different ways to look at these numbers, but that is a big number. So I'll be looking forward to understanding that better. And then lastly, if there's, I think what would be helpful is some sort of a public statement and a written statement that explains why in a city that has a budget that's 80% personnel costs and benefits, that the city governance body and the city manager has decided not to track costs and not to track personnel time on task. If you could just draft up some sort of public notice and distribute that, I think that would be really helpful, because we need to understand your thinking. Thank you.
Great. Any other public comments this evening on the FY 2020 tax rate?
Mayor. Mayor.
Yeah.
I just want to say that most people from Ward 1 are really nice, and I'm sorry if your experience was less than ideal.
Case in point, Jessica Landman, Ward 1. And Peter, that's really nice of you to say, considering the beating that you were taking on that same listserv today. So I'm here, unfairly, I might add. I'm here on behalf of Community Vision for Tacoma, and I'm going to summarize, if you don't mind, a letter that you received from Community Vision, which has some very important points on it. And the first one is that I want to ask you to keep our tax increases at a sustainable level. More people are being squeezed than you may think. At our recent community meeting held on a Friday night, we had a standing room only crowd of over 75 people who turned out to talk about the budget process. We heard from many people, a number of people who are being forced to plan to move or whose friends have had to move away because of property taxes. Our budget in this little city should not grow faster than the rate of inflation, and I beg you to keep those people in mind. Secondly, Community Vision for Tacoma wants to come back to the point that David was just making. Show us where our money goes. We want to be able to consider programs and their true complete costs when we decide as a community if they're for us. Begin tracking time on task. Please begin that on July 1st when the new fiscal year begins. We ask our council members, do not vote yes on this budget, if you intend to vote yes, until you get a commitment from the city manager that she will begin to work with the staff to figure out how to be able to tell you how much time people are spending on various things to help you and us decide how much programs are costing us, and then we can make intelligent decisions as a community. I, for one, would like to know how much we spend on having our own SWAT team. That might be a place where we could make a budget cut. How much staff time, how much equipment, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the kinds of things we want to be able to answer. And then I'm going to speak now for myself, not Community Vision for Tacoma, to say no more major capital projects should be launched until we have a handle on how the ones that are underway are working, including their hidden costs of staff time. Nobody can tell us what the city has spent thus far in terms of your staff and personnel expenses on Tacoma Junction. Like it or hate it, it's cost us a lot, and we want to know before we start another such thing. How are you giving the green light to potentially spending $800,000 for a third set of architectural plans for the library, a tear down and rebuild this time? That is fully 10% the cost of the proposed project, of the estimated, who knows how high it would go eventually. There has been no community discussion about this. Now, I asked an experienced architect, is it typical for the cost of architectural plans to be 10% of the total project cost of a project of this size? I was told that's unbelievably high. How in heaven's name did that number come up? I think this is evidence that we do not yet, as a city, have a handle on managing these major capital projects, and I ask you to be careful with our money. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments tonight on the second reading? Yeah.
Good evening, Paul Hubner, Ward 3. I want to concur with what the lady just spoke to. I think it's important that we get some metrics so we can measure these things. The $800,000 was 15% of the original number, $7 million, just coincidentally. And then the guy failed in that, and now he's up in the budget some more. So, I mean, these costs are never concrete. I predict, and the city manager can speak to this issue, that this project, slated for 8, will end up costing 12 plus. Okay, the same cost of this building right here. Okay, so fasten your seatbelts. I also would like to read something that was sent to me in the midst of this budget discussion, and the person writes to me, so the core issue behind increasing property taxes and an inflated and expensive city bureaucracy is gentrification. If our main focus has become increased property values and attracting upscale restaurants to our neighborhood, then our progressivism is nothing more than window dressing for some and a push out the door for long-term home and business owners. We are not supporting diversification, neither by race, national origins, culture, economic status, nor age. Property taxes driven by an expensive city government are pushing out older, long-term residents and preventing young families on modest incomes from joining the community. We are losing a rich diversity of people and the skills they brought to help build the community of Tacoma Park. One example to help illustrate my point, she says, Johnny, the former Tacoma Park resident who lived on Westmoreland Avenue for many years, he was an African-American working man who could repair lawnmowers and many of the other mechanical devices we all need in and around our homes. He left, he said, because the property taxes had become too much. For a town that prides itself on sustainability and diversity, we lost an important member of this community. And how, may I ask, are the refugees we are offering to take in going to be able to live here? Increases in property taxes help push the conversion of our existing stock of smaller, relatively inexpensive rental units back to single-family homes, displacing 4 to 6 family units of modest income earners for a single family with a much higher income. We are not fostering diversification nor inclusion. We are driving older homeowners, those that help build the city, out and excluding those who want to help build it for the future: shop owners, mechanics, surface workers, teachers, firefighters, and police.
Any other public comments this evening?
Just get my eyeballs on before you start the timer, please. Good evening, Jacqueline Moore, Ward 2. You may want to look up from your phones and listen to this one. I have some concerns and questions since you're voting on stormwater issues tonight about the stormwater drainage work being done on Lincoln Avenue in Ward 2. I understand that due to grant money issues with State Highway Association's Safe Routes to School program, that the sidewalk went in before the drainage system. This caused water problems with ponding and icing at the base of Aspen Avenue last fall, and the problems lasted through the winter. Sure, I could have called Public Works and asked them to sand the icy areas, but by the time they could have gotten to Aspen and Lincoln, I would have already needed to be at work. It makes zero sense at all to have installed the sidewalk before the drainage. If the city didn't have the money available to deal with the drainage, they should not have moved ahead with accepting the SHA grant money. This was putting the cart before the horse. The sidewalk and drainage work is yet another job that the city gave to the Beltsville contractor Jack Wazzari of NZI Construction. The concrete used on the retaining walls built along Lincoln had spalling issues that had to be repaired, and the sidewalk's still not a through shot from Jackson to Elm. There are a few areas where trees impede the installation of the sidewalk, and gravel's been put down around the trees. This is not in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Anyone moving down the sidewalk in a wheelchair or on a scooter will be forced to stop or dangerously go off-road, even if their mobility device does not have the appropriate wheels and tires should they wish to traverse the length of the sidewalk. The drainage work by NZI began last week. There was no notice to the residents with the start date of the project. Residents could see that something was coming because the streets were marked for misutility. Perhaps instead of sending Officer Rick Baravecchia to remove community information and event flyers from utility poles, over which the city does not have jurisdiction, he could have distributed or posted flyers about the drainage work in the affected Ward 2 neighborhood. The money for the drainage project flyers, copying, and the police man-hour needed for distribution to the residents, or rather man-half hour, could easily have been skimmed from the city manager's portion of our city budget. One of my Lincoln Avenue neighbors asked for details about the drainage project. She was sent a copy of the schematic drawings for the plan. This was not helpful to her. I can understand these drawings thanks to my college engineering professor's tutelage, but they are indecipherable to many people who just want to know if they'll have water and if it's safe to drink. On Friday, May 10th, the water was cut for several hours. Once it came back on, the water ran brown out of household faucets. No notice was given regarding the water cutoff, and no information about the potability of the brown water was given either. There are 8 houses on Aspen Avenue. Of the 7 houses that are occupied, there's a total of 11 children ranging in age from a year-old to 16 years old. 5 of these kids are under the age of 4. A premature baby and her stressed-out parents also live at the corner of Aspen and Boyd. Why would the city needlessly worry any of these parents? Given that NZI Construction has done the majority of the work on the city's sidewalk projects, I'm starting to wonder if the owner of this company is related to someone in the city government. Is this guy somebody's mother's brother's cousin? Is this why NZI keeps getting our contracts even though this mid-sized 50 to 99 employee business is non-union and only in the top 37% of similar businesses?
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Thank you. Could you please email us the copy of your letter?
You got it in your hands, but I'll email it too.
Thank you. Any other, we're also doing public comments right now on our voting items. This is the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 tax rate.
Mary Jane Manchewy, Ward 2, a longtime resident. I've lived here almost 33 years in Boyd Avenue, but previously that I lived almost 2 years on Lee Avenue as an apartment dweller. I'm asking you to please vote against the tax increase. Between me and my son with disabilities, we make only about $50,000 a year after we pay for health insurance. Yet I'm sick, but I'm not contagious, okay? But I watched from the comfort of my home last Wednesday's meeting, and I think the mayor said that the median income for our apartment dwellers was around $80,000 a year, and well, sorry if I got that wrong, but on the homeowners it's around $140,000. Well, that's no excuse for taxing us. We are low-income homeowners. Why should we be taxed that much? I mean, I did get $900 check back from the city, and I appreciate that, but that still makes me over $5,000 we still have to pay. And there are 4 possible state and county tax credits for residents, but you have to be almost a tax lawyer to understand them, and at one you even have to turn in your tax return from the previous years, which I think is an invasion of privacy. And that was the one that I qualify for, that we qualify for, because we make less than $60,000 a year. That's the only one we qualify for. The other ones were if you live in a historic district, which we don't, you have lived here 40 years or a veteran, which we don't, or if your tax assessment went over 10% more this year, which it didn't. So we'd hardly lucked out at all this year. And I'm just saying, please help us. I mean, please take this in consideration. And I plan not to, if any of you all vote for the tax return, I don't plan to vote for you. Not that I can vote for you, except for the mayor and Cindy. I'm sorry. I'm against the wall. We're up against the wall.
Any other comments tonight on our second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 tax rate? Okay, seeing none, we then have our second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 stormwater management budget. Any public comments on that? We have our second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 budget. Then we have a resolution supporting regionalism in the Washington metropolitan area. And then we have our consent agenda that includes appointments to or reappointments to the Noise Control Board, the Recreation Committee, and the Nuclear Free Tacoma Park Committee. Any comments on that? All right, seeing no comments on that, then we will move now into our voting session. The first item is the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 tax rate. There are no changes from our first reading. Would someone like to move the ordinance?
So moved.
Councilmember Siemens moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
Councilwoman Searcy, second. Almost called you Councilwoman Talisha. Second. Any comments or discussion on the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 tax rate? None? Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. You mentioned in the upcoming schedule that we're doing a review or dive into the budget process issues I think next week, but can you just say a little bit more about what the plans are for doing those things? How we're going to look into it, or is there just one at the moment planned? Or I heard you mention several others. I just wasn't quite
So,
sure.
yeah, so what we have planned so far in the, for our agenda items is next week, while it's still fresh in our mind, we wanted to have a session where we reviewed the processes and how things, went this year. Thanks to resident input and the hard work of our city staff, we did implement a number of changes for the budget process this year. So we wanted to review what changes were made, and a number of things have also come up in the process of other things we want to look at for next year. So we wanted to do that next week while it's fresh in our mind. If we feel there are things that come up with that want future follow-up, we can schedule future work sessions. In addition, we have scheduled in July a conversation to look at tax rebates. Thank you, Ms. Machui, for that feedback. I think that will be part of our discussion, is to figure out difficulties people do have accessing some of the rebates that are now and credits that are now available, and then what the city can do in addition to what's out there. We're doing that in July because there's some analysis we would request of the city staff to do, and because of when the audit gets done, and that needs to happen as soon as the budget is finished, July is the best time to do that. And then we also talked about, I think it was Councilwoman Kostick requested a deeper dive after the budget on the Recreation Department. So we're going to have a joint meeting with the Recreation Department and our Recreation Committee, and I think that's being scheduled soon. And then there were a number of other things that we wanted to look into. We do have the compensation study that was done that we'll look at. Councilwoman DeBala has asked regarding personnel, and again, that was just a question of figuring out a time. So
The one other thing I think would be great to add, and I don't know if this is actually doable, but a lot of the questions that have come up about the assessments, and I know it's not in our direct control, and I know the state may not that willingly do it, but it seemed more random and less logical this year than in past years. So to the extent we could explore that, and I understand the state doesn't have to do what we want, but I think it'd be worth trying. So
yeah, so I asked the city clerk to add it to our listings that we can actually invite someone from
Right.
the comptroller's office perhaps to come and speak to us about
Yeah,
that.
it'd be from the State Department of Assessment
Sorry,
and
yeah.
Taxation.
But not for like an individuals to complain about their individual rates, but to see what the thematic point was, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. All right, Councilmember Smith?
First, I'd like to thank everyone who commented on the budget. This is probably the most important thing that we do up here as a council. I do feel everybody's pain when it comes to, contemplating tax increases. I think we do need to do more for those people in the middle. There are a number of programs for lower income people, and those people that are at the top of the economic ladder, this is not going to hurt them as much. But I do think that we need to really look at how we decide what is going to be our future tax increases going forward. We need to look at if we're going to look at constant yield plus a COLA of sorts. We need to really and make sure that that is how we decide on future budgets for this city. Another thing that I hope my colleagues will consider is taking up time on task for employees in the city, finding out some way that we can determine what projects people are working on. I think the request from Ms. Landman is reasonable. David Navari has talked about this on a number of occasions, and I think we should be able to do this for our next budget next year. So thank you very much. This is not something that we are going to stop talking about. I hope as a council, it is extremely, extremely important. And this budget, I believe, is going to define how the city looks, who's going to live in this city for years to come.
Thank you. Councilwoman DeBala?
Yes, thank you. I won't repeat what I said last week about how I look at this budget and this tax rate, but I had a couple of things on my list, and one of them was a question about where we are with getting someone to talk to us and residents about the state assessments. I was going to ask about the library, but I see that you are going to cover that later, because I had, and I'm not the only one, had asked you about to break down the $800,000. What is it not? And so you'll do that in a few minutes, I guess. And I'm also interested in a pilot on time on task, and asking that we set some time aside. I thought we might talk about that next week, but maybe I'm wrong about that. To see whether that's an issue
We can, I think
rather than tonight, to see if we can work through.
I don't think
Yeah.
I would say, given, yes, I would.
right.
And I would
Yes
say,
is a
and not
good
to
answer.
speak for the city manager, but this is something that I discussed with the city manager and the deputy city manager in our weekly meetings about, as I've discussed with Mr. Navari, is like putting into place a pilot project to see, setting out what the objectives are of this clearly and how we would go about doing it, and then trying it and seeing what made sense. Because we also want to make sure that we're doing something that we understand why we're doing it, and that's clear for the staff, it's clear for us as a city council, and making sure that the residents who have requested it, we're also doing what they're asking us to do. And so one of the things first is clarifying the objectives, and I don't think we're going to do that tonight. We may start upon that next week, but that might be something else we want to do. So I would say for everyone who has asked that question, the answer is yes, we're moving forward with a pilot project, and there's more to come on that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that for everybody. And then I was going to mention the work session on personnel costs that I had requested, which will be scheduled in the future. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Kostick.
I want to reiterate my thanks to all of the residents who spoke tonight and have contacted me and other members of the council and been involved in this budget process. I think there's been a particularly large amount of discussion about the budget this year, and I think that's great. I'm really excited and enthused to see more people being a part of that process and discussing it. And I think we have some work to do to make sure that that information is getting out to everyone in the community, and that we're getting a range of different perspectives. But I think this is an excellent start to that discussion, and I'm looking forward to trying some new things in the future. I agree with Councilmember Smith and his perspective on trying to look ahead and set some goals for tax rates in the future, so that we have something that we're working towards. And I appreciate the upcoming work sessions that we have scheduled. I think that will help address some of the things that have come up during our discussions this year during the budget season. And I hope will continue as we are going throughout the year, focusing on a variety of different topics. We have on our agenda item every week, a fiscal impact statement. And that's something we should be paying more attention to sometimes. So I think that's something we need to be sure to look at. I'm also interested in finding out a little more about what options we have for tracking time on task. Actually, myself, all this discussion has gotten me interested in it, and I started tracking my own time on task this past week. Not related to specific projects, but related to sort of types of activity, emails, meetings, meeting prep, and it's been really interesting. So I'm interested in seeing if I can keep that up and gathering some data, but it's been an interesting process. So I appreciate that suggestion. And I actually would like to ask if the city manager could speak now about the library project, so we could just have a discussion prior to voting on the budget.
Shall I? Okay. So in recent days, we've received questions about what the $800,000 in the CIP for the library includes. In short, these funds, which are from the $7 million library bond the city borrowed 2 years ago, are set aside to be used primarily for detailed design by our architect, which is required in order to go out to bid for construction. More specifically, the funds are expected to cover the following from design through construction administration: architectural design, structural engineering, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineering, civil engineering and survey, interior design, cost estimating, geotechnical engineering. We recently received the work proposal from the architect, which is currently being reviewed by our construction contract attorney. Once we are satisfied with the proposal, an agenda item will go to council to authorize the city manager to execute a contract. From there, the architect and their subcontractors will work on the detailed design. An early July council work session is planned so that there can be a discussion of the plans to date, matters concerning the floodplain, interrelationships with other spaces in the community center, particularly the recreation department and the bathrooms, and funding sources and funding constraints. We intend to share information on plan elements as they are available, and when the detailed designs are completed, they will be brought forward to council. Then the council will decide whether to go out to bid based on the detailed design and cost estimates. While we have estimates currently, and I appreciated that the architect has gone to an experienced estimator at each stage so that we have good estimates, we will continue to have better estimates as the design is prepared. We will not know what construction costs will actually be until we receive bids from construction firms. Based on how the bids come in and the available funding in the budget for the project, we may or may not need to make modifications to the design. In short, there are many decisions to be considered and opportunities for discussions. Just as a note, just if you look in the CIP, any of our long-term multi-year projects, we estimate what will be the monies for those projects. And so the $800,000 is the same as the amount set aside for Flower Avenue and for some of these other large multi-year projects.
And my understanding is, based on what you said, that we will need to vote to authorize you to enter into a contract so that most of those funds are spent. Is that right?
Right, if it's how you want to move forward. And so that is information that you'll see when you have the contract in front of you, and then there will be a couple other times when you'll have those same kind of options.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you to everyone who have been coming here each week to give us your opinions on especially on the budget. And first of all, I don't know how many of you have paid attention through the years that I've been on the council, but I have periodically suggested that it would be helpful to the council and beneficial in working on the budget to do better timekeeping. I have staff do better timekeeping and do it at a program level so that we knew more specifically, what it was costing for programs such as in the recreation department, and many of the different activities that staff does based on what the council has asked, the work the council has asked to be done. It's, in my opinion, difficult to evaluate whether a specific project or program is beneficial or cost-effective for us to continue doing, and makes it difficult to know what programs we would want to reduce or cut from the budget. This has not been something that has been supported enthusiastically by many other council members during my time on the council. But I do think that with the public input that we're getting now and the encouragement that we're getting, as you've heard tonight, some members of the council are interested in looking at that. I think it sounds like an easy thing to do. It's an easy thing to suggest. It's a complicated thing to implement, and if we, I don't think it's a black and white issue. I think there are choices that need to be made in putting together a time reporting system like that. What kinds of things do we want to track? What kind of things would be too difficult to track? We don't want a system, we would not want a system that is overly burdensome on the employees. But I just I just add that, I was in the consulting business for many years, and I had different customers and different projects, and every one of those customers and every one of those bills that got sent out had to be able to explain what work was done and what project I was working on, and broken down to pretty fine number of hours. And so it's not an impossible thing to do, but it's going to take some time. And I think I'm feeling confident that this council, as we move through this next year, is at least going to talk about it and see what we can craft, and see if we do find, see if other council members find that it could be beneficial. And I don't think it has to be a win and a loss. I think that done correctly, everybody's going to win at the end of the day. And then the other thing I'd just like to mention is the library. I appreciate getting the update from the city manager. As you all know, I was here, and as were many of you during the community center renovation. It was a few years ago. Yeah, but I don't want to say I see similarities between that and what's going on with the library, but I think any major project like that does have some similarities, and so I'm I don't think nervous is the right word, but I'm paying attention to what's going on. But I don't think at this point in time it's necessary to just say, well, let's pull the rug out from under the whole thing. We've got some money in there for refining the plans now. But I think we have enough checkpoints along the way during this coming year that the council will be able to ask the tough questions and make the tough decisions. I'm hopeful that we can end up with an improved library. I think the community, the majority of the community wants that, but I think we're going to have to be cautious that we don't paint ourselves into a corner where we're spending more money than we have or want to spend. So that's all to say. I will be voting for the budget. Thank you.
Councilwoman Searcy.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you all for coming out tonight and many other nights and expressing your concern regarding the budget. This isn't an easy task for myself, or I'm assuming for any of my colleagues here. No one wants to make a decision that could potentially put financial strain on communities or on our community. One thing that I am cognizant of is the need for a way to target. So I agree with Councilmember Smith that it is important for us to try to identify what that target should be. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that some of the things that we did in prior years in terms of the tax rate that was set us up for this moment. So when we are setting prior budgets and tax rates below constant yield, eventually you have to pay the piper. And unfortunately, now is the time for us to try to make some of those things right. One thing that I would like to see in future budgets, especially as it pertains to adding additional personnel, if there were some way for us to try to extrapolate. One of the challenges last budget cycle was that we were adding or making decisions about adding FTE, but we're not accounting for a full year's worth of that FTE salary. And so on the surface, it's like, oh yeah, we can lower the tax rate, but the next year you have to pay not 3 months of this person's time. You're paying a full year's worth of this person's salary. And that's going to increase the total cost that the city is facing. And so as we are talking through some of the processes and as we're talking through some of the things that we might want to reevaluate,
I think one of the things that's going to be important is kind of thinking about how some of the things and some of the decisions that we make now might have impacts for the next budget cycle. Because the writing was a little bit on the wall last year. And it could have been an opportunity for us to start setting the stage with residents to say, you would get a little bit of a reprieve, but know that we're only allocating for a quarter of a person's time, and we're saying we want this person, so we have to pay for them a full year the next year. Another thing that I do appreciate about this cycle is it has opened folks to think creatively about revenue generation. And I do think now is the time for us to think about a lot of things differently. It's really easy to rest on the low-hanging fruit in terms of revenue, which unfortunately is tax-paying homeowners, right? You set your goals around how many homes do we have, how many commercial properties do we have, and what we may be able to get. But I do think that now is the time for us is for us to start thinking, one, about how are we investing in ways that could ultimately increase revenues from some of our commercial districts. Not necessarily an increase in tax rate, because I don't think that's the way to do it, but how do we help get to the point where we have booming and very viable commercial districts, and how that ultimately will impact the community is important. I also think it's important for us, I know they're pretty time intensive, but there's a lot of resources out there, financial resources, and how are we actually looking at other grants and things of that nature that might be available to the city now, given where we are in terms of opportunity zone designation and other types of revenues that may be available to us now that maybe weren't available previously. So definitely, as we're thinking through not just the process of the budget, how are we engaging the community? How are we calculating time that staff spend? I think that's something that's important to try to figure out a way to do in terms of time on task. I think many people will be surprised at how much constituent engagement or resident engagement staff spend time doing. Quite frankly, I'm just going to be candid. You spend a lot of time engaging residents, quite frankly, sometimes to the detriment of actually getting the programmatic work done. Which, if you're talking about trying to get revenues through like grants and things like that, then you have to make sure that you're hitting those goals as well, right? So I do look forward to having some conversations, some frank and candid and real conversations about how we can do things differently. And it might mean staff doing things differently. It may mean the council making decisions differently, but it also may mean residents having different expectations of staff, right? So if we're all collectively thinking about how to make this process better, that means we all may be collectively asked to make some changes in terms of our expectations and the way in which we operate. And so I just want to end by saying I'm committed to rethinking the way that I do things and rethinking how perhaps staff may be able to do things in a way that would be more cost effective. And definitely look forward to having conversations with residents about ways in which we can all kind of do things and think about things differently to try to lower the financial burden that homeowners are facing. Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar, did you have something else to say?
Yeah, I had asked about the schedule. I just had a couple other comments to make, if you don't mind. Thanks. I had mentioned previously and voted last week against the budget and the tax rate. I'm going to do that again. I thought we could have reduced spending a little bit and had a slightly lower rate. I do want to say something about the library, though, because I think it's possible to afford that even within what I thought of could have been a little bit less. And I think it's really important to make a couple of points on that. Number one, at this point, nothing is 100% locked in. The city manager mentioned that the contract is coming before us. We have to vote for any contracts that are worth more than, I think it's $5,000. So we'll have to vote on that. If we vote against the contract, then at that point, at least with that design, the project wouldn't go forward. And then we have additional steps, which were also mentioned, at which we would have the opportunity to vote on it. And it's not just going to be, here it is, decide whether you want to vote on it. We're going to get some information about it. We're going to understand the concerns about the floodplain, et cetera. And to me, a major difference between this project and Councilmember Siemens referred to this, a big difference between this project, the library, and the community center project is that in that case, it was only after all the design work had been completed and construction was ready to start, as I understand it, that then the floodplain issues came in. So in this case, it's being done differently. It's being done in advance precisely to avoid that. So I can't tell someone not to feel nervous or concerned that we could be going down the same path again, but it's different because we're actively not doing that. And I just want to know, I think that's an important thing to say. A lesson may or may not have been learned entirely, but that's what we're doing. So I think it's really important to emphasize that. And to me, if it ends up that it's proves to be more expensive once we get the bids and so on, or once we look at the design work, there are things in it we don't like, we can change it. So at this point, I don't view it as complete. And I think the other point, and I will stop, is that projects of this kind are iterative. You can't sit here at this point and say, here's every detail on how it's going to work out. It just doesn't happen that way. I think the same thing has been true of the Junction project. Frankly, there's a desire for people to know exactly how it's going to be. Those things roll out over time. And even if you've had projects in your home, and many of us have, and of course, sometimes they cost more, that's true, but also details unfurl as they go along. The first day or the first month or the first time you sit down with your designer, you don't know every detail. You figure those things out later. And so I appreciate the reality that people get concerned when there's an expensive project and want to know all the details in advance, but we're not going to. And so it's going to take some patience. But again, nothing's locked in. I'm a strong supporter of the project based on everything I know about it so far, but we'll be looking very carefully at it and not just assuming that everything is fine. So thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly. I meant earlier to thank all the residents in Ward 2 who came out and spoke and who contacted me in one form or another. Last year I was complaining because I didn't hear from anybody on the budget, even though I was beating the bushes for comments. So I've got an embarrassment of riches this time round, but I'd much rather have it that way. And I know that not everybody will be happy with how I'm voting on this, but I do think it's a process that goes on over time and not just something that is captured in a couple of weeks with a one-shot vote. And I'm pretty serious about that aspect of it. So I intend to stay on some of the bigger issues, and I hope you'll stay with me on that. Thank you.
All right, I'll just close this out by saying that I want to thank my colleagues, the city staff and residents for all their hard work and input on the budget this year. Sorry, Ms. Michiui, I'm going to vote for this budget because I actually think we came to a very good place this year. We weighed the opportunities we have, the challenges we have moving forward, and looking at a tax rate that looks at constant yield plus an inflation indicator, and this year employee cost index is the one. And maybe, as Councilmember Smith has said or others have said, maybe we'll look at something different that might be a better marker in the future. I actually don't believe that lowering the tax rate across the board in ways that may hamper our ability to provide things like rent stabilization or funding for our affordable housing reserve or making sure that we can continue to offer free rec programs is necessarily the way to do it, because we do have homeowners and people who live in our community who can pay the taxes at this moment. And what we need to do is devise programs to assist those who cannot. And so the tax rebate program that Councilwoman Dabala has put forward is one that we kept money in the budget this year. We could have actually lowered the tax rate, but we made a decision during reconciliation to keep money in there so that we could look at how we can provide more targeted assistance to individuals who need it. And that's, I think, the way that we're really going to help benefit people in this community, is if we have targeted programs to really help people who need it. And so I really thank you for coming this evening and talking about the difficulties you've had, because I think the other thing we need to know is what are the barriers people face to accessing the programs that we do have available, and how can we as a city augment those programs. Yeah, I think with that, I just want to again thank everyone. I think we had a good process this year, and we can always make it better, and I look forward to continuing the work. And with that, I will ask the city clerk to call the roll, or call the vote.
Councilmember Kovar,
Which one are we voting on now?
this is the tax rate.
No.
Councilmember DeBala,
Yes.
Councilmember Costick, Councilmember Siemens, Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy, Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, now we'll vote for going into convene as the Stormwater Management Board. All those in favor of convening in the Stormwater, someone move to go into the Stormwater Management Board? Councilman DeBala first, Councilmember Smith second. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, now we'll do the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 storm management budget. There's no change from last week. Would someone like to move this? Councilman Searcy, do I have a second?
Second.
Councilmember Siemens, any discussion of this? Councilwoman DeBala? Okay.
I have just
yeah.
a random comment, which is I've always wondered whether we have to dissolve being a stormwater management board,
No,
or if we
don't.
continue
don't.
to be the
No, we
stormwater
can
management
continue
board
and
for the
do
rest
other.
of the.
Yeah, we can.
We've
checked. We did check one year, yes. It's a good question. And gets filtered. No. All right, seeing no comments or questions, I'll ask the clerk to call the vote.
Councilmember Kovar.
Aye.
Councilmember DeBala. Councilmember Costick. Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy. Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, next we have the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2020 budget. Will someone like to move this? Councilwoman Searcy, do I have a second?
Second.
Councilmember Siemens, any questions, comments, remarks? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to call the vote.
Councilmember Kovar.
No.
Councilmember DeBala.
Yes.
Councilmember Costick.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy. Mayor Stewart.
Yes. Next, we have the resolution supporting regionalism in the Washington metropolitan area. We did have a change to this resolution that was put forward by Councilwoman Costick for members of the City Council. That change is in your blue folder that you received, and I have just messed up every one of my papers in front of me this evening. I found it. All right, so it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is the seventh additional whereas clause, whereas for innovative transit solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, serve residents' transportation needs, and reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles crowding our streets, regional cooperation is necessary. So that is the addition. I will ask if someone would like to move this with the addition. Councilwoman Costick moves. Do I have a second?
Second.
Councilwoman Searcy, second. Any comments or questions on this one? No, I just want to, Councilwoman Costick, yeah.
I'll keep this very brief,
Yeah.
but I think this is a great resolution, and I think it's really important that we're thinking regionally, especially related to transportation, which is why I wanted to add this. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, and I'll just comment on it. The base document came from Alexandria,
Mhm.
so I appreciated them. I tweaked it a little bit on some of the things, but I was so glad that you added the transportation language, because it is part of our whole regional system, and it's great to call it out.
Is this something that COG is distributing to other jurisdictions? Because it'd be
So
great
it was
to
dis-
push
It
for
was
everyone to do it.
It was distributed through the Chief Administrative Officers Committee at COG, and so I think it was the Alexandria elected officials were
Yeah.
encouraging others to do it.
Yeah, that's great. Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that the resolution is great, but I also want to point out there's some really practical reasons why being involved regionally works for the city that may not jump out at first reading. We get access to funding. We get access to technical assistance from regional organizations, and we get a stronger voice for lobbying for the things that we need. So on a very pragmatic level, this works, in addition to it being a good idea generally. Thank you.
I think this might be an excellent time to talk about to preempt the city manager's comments and just tell people about the funding we received from the Transportation Planning Board.
Perhaps Ms. Costick would
Yeah,
like to announce it.
Councilwoman Costick would like to tell us about this.
Sure, thank you. I didn't do much except vote today, but I have very good news from the Transportation Planning Board today. The application for a Transportation Land Use Connections Grant that the city had applied for was awarded, and the city has been awarded $50,000 for a bus stop accessibility inventory that is going to look at ADA compliance, accessibility, and bike and ped improvements at bus stops. This is one of 13 projects that was approved as part of this program that the TPB administers, and there were a number of other applications, so this was seen as a very successful and important project. So I think it's great news.
That's great.
I'd also like to thank Councilwoman Costick for being present and voting for it, and also thank the city staff for pulling it together and putting in the grant. I know we get asked many times from residents, do we go after grants? And the answer is yes, and this is one that we were able to get. So thank you very much to the staff's work on this. All right, all those in favor, oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Smith, I didn't see your light.
I just have a question about the resolution. Why now is this regionalism push coming about from COG? Because I thought, in past years, we've always said that was why COG was there in the first place, for us all to work together, and it was the convening body, the MPO for us. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason why that now there's a resolution stating this?
I think it's that while those folks who are involved in COG know that, it's not really known in the various jurisdictions. And so I think the Alexandria Council felt that it was important to say, regionalism is important. And it's also goes to that point that we talk about a lot during budget time, which is the city of Tacoma Park doesn't have to provide all the services, doesn't have to do all the lifting. How we work together can get us more. But I don't think there was a particular lever, button that made it for right now. It's just that Alexandria felt that was something that they weren't on the record about, and they should be, and everybody should be.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All those in favor of the resolution, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? Okay. Next, we have our consent agenda. Would someone like to move the consent agenda? Councilwoman Costick, do I have a second? Councilmember Smith. All those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? All right. Now we'll have other public comments, and I believe we have some residents who have a petition they would like to present to us this evening. So if you please come to the podium. And I think I'm only 8 minutes off from when I told you. Or maybe I might have said 8:15, so sorry.
No, this is great. This has been very enlightening just to see the discussion leading up to this too. I'm Christopher Coury. I'm a resident of Ward 1. I've lived in the area for a number of years, at least 8 years now in Tacoma Park, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with the council, and thank Mayor Stewart tonight for having us alongside my neighbors who are here. Also want to thank our council member Peter for being supportive to our concerns and very constructive in his suggestions thus far. We were actually here about, 2 or 3 years ago, and we were talking about very similar issues back then. We've come back with quite a bit more support now. I'm speaking today on behalf of about 124 different supporters of a community petition that we circulated electronically recently. I believe you all have copies of it. I do have extra here if you need them. The petition focuses on long-standing safety issues on one of our primary arteries of the city, and that's Philadelphia Avenue. As you all know, the street is home to many families with small children, including my own 2 boys, 2.5 and 6.5. Our elementary schools are on this street, other nearby schools, bus transportation, libraries, everything that we're at right now, including down the street, Montgomery College, parks and playgrounds. This is our main corridor. We use it for all kinds of things besides just getting to and fro. The avenue and its sidewalks, its signals, its markings are unnecessarily dangerous to our residents and particularly our pedestrians. The petition signers all signed on to some statements I'll go over very briefly. We really believe strongly, and we've mulled over this and talked over this a lot, that these requests are eminently reasonable, they're possible, they're very low cost, and they're the right thing to do if we're to achieve a basic level of safety in this community for our residents and pedestrians. It will require strong leadership from the city, county, and state level, and we're here to sort of spur that on and support wherever needed. So I'm going to go over, we've got 6 things in the petition. I'm going to go over them very briefly. The first is reduce the speed limit on Philadelphia Avenue consistently from 30 to 25. As you know, outside this building, it's 25 and lower during school hours. 1 block away, it's 30 miles per hour for absolutely no good reason at all. And we think it should be consistent throughout the city to be 25 miles per hour so drivers aren't fluctuating as much as they are right now. Number 2, provide an accessible pedestrian route on the sidewalks. For any of you that actually walk on the sidewalks here, much of it is in decrepit condition, to be quite frank. If you go further down to Silver Spring Intermediate Park, where Philadelphia and College Avenue intersect, it is so bad that if you're on a stroller, a bicycle, a wheelchair of any sort, you are risking your life every single day. So that's number 2. Number 3, provide a rectangular rapid flashing beacon at that same intersection where it crosses into Montgomery County College. Students cross back and forth there every day and use the park. There are known very low-cost solutions to making the ability to cross the street much safer than it is now, just by physical markings on the ground and other types of changes. Number 4, immediately implement specific low-cost intersection improvements. Again, 1 block away, you can look at Philadelphia Avenue and Piney Branch and notice that the no turn on red signals are inconsistent. And we can go into more detail about why that's dangerous and reckless. You will also notice that if you try and cross the street, the pedestrian signals that you hit don't automatically turn when it's green, so it's pedestrian unfriendly, and it's dangerous if you're trying to cross the street there. And the signals are not responsive to pedestrians. You still have to wait for the lights to turn. Number 5, resurface Philadelphia Avenue to reduce vibration and damage to adjacent houses. We're quite aware, living on the street in my case, that WSSC has been doing quite a lot of construction. This is complex to coordinate. We totally understand that, but we're in a historic district and we're watching our homes literally get damaged every single day because of the poor condition of the streets, the high speed of the cars that are literally shaking our homes to their foundation, and also making for unsafe transit on those roads for vehicles too. And other types of transportation. Number 6, and the last one, at Philadelphia and Tacoma Avenue, various vestiges of old traffic signals and poles and whatnot. No one's thought through that, or apparently no one has done enough or sufficient coordination there to make it a harmonious intersection that makes sense to anyone using it. So, those are the 6. As I mentioned, with little effort, we received about 124 signatures. Most of them are from residents of Tacoma Park or neighboring Silver Spring. And I'm just going to kind of end and give my time to my other neighbor. But we had one Tacoma Park resident who's named Kristen provided an additional color when she signed the petition. She says, "I cross Philadelphia Avenue at Piney Branch almost every day, often with my small children. It can be terrifying even with a light. Please help." So with that, I'm going to ask my neighbor, Dan, who has a lot of expertise in this space, to speak about some specific asks we have of the council. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. My name is Dan Goodman. I've lived on Philadelphia Avenue for almost a decade. I've got 3 young children, similar to Chris. I wanted to build on what Chris said by emphasizing 3 specific points. The first point is that we've got a window of opportunity right now. We can narrow the existing travel lanes when we resurface Philadelphia Avenue. At the same time that we reduce the speed limit and do some enhanced police enforcement. The 3 of those things are mutually reinforcing. They're low cost, as Chris said, and taken together, they can change behavior of drivers on Philadelphia Avenue, and that's what we're looking for. We want to reduce the speed of cars and drivers to enhance the safety of our children, and we think that those three things together, there's a window of opportunity to do those right now. The second point is that we need to prioritize the safety of pedestrians crossings. We can do that by no turn on red signals, leading pedestrian intervals, making the signals fixed signals, and enhancing the crossing at Chicago. So we need to increase the pedestrian safety. And the thing I want to emphasize is that the trade-offs are very, very minimal in these situations. They're low cost, and the only trade-off that we have on something like no turn on red is really a minor inconvenience to people driving. And what we're asking for is your support in prioritizing pedestrian safety over that minor inconvenience. The third thing that we're asking for is, the third point that I want to make is to emphasize again that what we're asking for is little to no cost. It's minimal trade-offs. It's things like paint, signal timing, signs. Those are all things that are going to be done anyway when Philadelphia Avenue is resurfaced. And so what we're asking is that you help us make sure that we do it right. When SHA and WSSC go out to resurface the road, that we do it right. And we don't let them just go out and replace what's there now, because what's there now is not working. So 2 primary asks that we're asking of you as our city council. The first one is that we would like you to acknowledge and hopefully also express support for the points in our petition. So you could do that through a resolution, or you could do that through a letter. We would defer to you on how you'd like to do that. But we think it's really important that the city council makes sure that SHA knows about our petition and the points on the petition, and also that WSSC understands those points and hopefully understands that you're supportive of them. In the letter, we would ask that you say that you as a city council expect SHA and WSSC to share their restriping plan with you before they go out and do it on our road. We would like to know what that is, and we believe that we have a right to review it and suggest minor, relatively low-cost tweaks to it that will improve safety, and we're asking for your help on that. The second thing, in addition to the letter, is that we would ask that you ask the police chief to provide an opinion about lowering the speed limit from 30 to 25. We understand that the police chief is relatively new, and we would like to give him an opportunity to provide his opinion on that. We believe that it will enhance safety for everyone, and we hope that he's supportive of that. So in closing, we're asking that you actively support our efforts on this petition. They're practical recommendations to improve safety. They take advantage of the opportunity that exists with the planned resurfacing. And we ask that you do it now before a tragedy occurs.
Thank you.
Now is the right time.
Great,
you so
thank you.
much.
Thank you very much. I just have one question for you. Have you contacted our state delegation at all?
Peter suggested that this afternoon, and we'd be happy to do that.
I had a conversation with Councilmember Kovar and suggested it because our delegation actually just happened to be out meeting with SHA. We actually didn't know this. The other day on Piney Branch. And so I think having that quote you had about from the person crossing on Philadelphia to Piney Branch. So with your permission, I'd also ask that if after our meeting tonight, City TV could do what we've done in the past, which is do a clip of this presentation of yours and share that not just with SHA, but with our state delegation as well.
That'd be great.
So.
Thank you so much.
Great. All right.
Could I just jump in too? I do want to be clear, although I had passed on the idea of contacting them, that did come from the mayor. And I'd just like to say a couple of points about this. Number one, I appreciate very much that Chris and Dan took the time to come here today. And I see Rosemary, who's another person affected by the shaking in particular, who is here. And most of these issues, with a couple of exceptions, are things we've been talking about for a while. I think timing-wise, with what we hope will soon be the completion of the WSSC project, then this is a very opportune moment for this. I am actually talking separately to one of our delegates later in the week, and I'll mention it at that point. I would like the council, and I don't think we're going to decide this right now, but to agree to do a letter or a resolution or something to SHA and to see how we can work with the police chief as necessary on the safety pieces to try to address as many of these as we can. And I just want to mention, another group has come forward in the past to point out the deficiencies on Philadelphia and Park, a little outside the jurisdiction of where Dan and Chris are, but similar kind of thing. And they just sent me a video the other day of cars just shooting up there and buses shooting up there without even stopping. So all of these things just about have been mentioned to SHA in the past. I want to make sure that we do contact them, and if we're going to have another, what we call the quarterly meetings with them, bring it up then. But I know we're doing the Tacoma Junction visioning piece, but I don't want us to be in a situation where we can't have more than one thing at a time pending with State Highway. So I'm hopeful that this will be able to be part of that too. So, and I encourage my colleagues, I'll circle back with each of you later, to consider doing the letter or the resolution to State Highway to express support for the concepts that have been raised here that fit in with them. And I did mention that this was happening to the police chief, and we'll see where that goes too. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Any other public comments this evening? All right. Well, then we'll move on. Seeing no other public comments, we'll move on to council comments. Any council comments? Councilwoman Kostick.
I want to thank you for coming with your recommendations along Philadelphia Avenue. I think I'm looking forward to reviewing these a little more and talking with Councilmember Kovar and city staff about what options we have to move forward with that. A question for the city manager. When is our next quarterly meeting? Or I feel like it's been a while since we've had one.
We've been trying to get it scheduled.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
don't have a date yet, but we've been pushing hard for it, so I would hope it would be soon.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's technically not a quarterly, so we call it the quarterly meeting, but as, when we established this, SHA asked if, getting a lot of feedback, that especially during the winter months, because it is so hectic with weather events, that we not schedule something from like November to March.
So it's like 3 times
So it's
a
like
year.
3 times a year, but it's easier to say quarterly meeting.
Yeah, there's also a concern I've heard from people recently was the crosswalk on Carroll near Columbia and the safety there as well. So I think there are a number of issues that we probably need to address with SHA and talk through.
Yeah, if you can actually, if people can, because we, it reminded me when Councilmember Kovar said, we don't just bring up one issue when we meet during these meetings. We do have a running list that the Director of Public Works keeps. So if there items that have come up, if you send them to myself and to Ms. Braithwaite, we'll make sure they get on the list, and then we will as we've done in the past, circulate that list to the full City Council before we sit down with SHA to have a discussion.
Other comments? Good news in a different part of the city regarding roads. Pepco is working on moving forward with resurfacing Eastern, and they're awaiting permits from DDOT. There's been a slight delay because of that, but they have it tentatively on their look-ahead schedule for starting this week or next. So hopefully that will move forward soon, and they anticipate that the repaving will happen from New Hampshire Avenue to Laurel. So it will be that full section, and it'll take about 3 weeks to get to that. They will be tearing up a part of it after they resurface it to do further work between Whittier and Walnut, but it should be significantly better than it is currently. I want to thank the residents who, I think this happened a few weeks ago, but I got an update recently, so I want to thank the residents who were involved in the Jabo Kali yard sale event. I just got an email from Ellen Pearson, who was the resident who kind of spearheaded it, and she said they raised a significant amount of money, I think close to $700, for the Horticulture Club and their event that they have regarding native species. So I think that will be a great contribution to them. I didn't coordinate with my colleagues on an update regarding trees, but I can go ahead and do that. We've been talking about the upcoming efforts of the City Council to review the tree ordinance and work on developing tree canopy goals. The Committee on the Environment and the Tree Commission have been working together to come up with some recommendations that they're going to bring to the Council. But we have kind of set some tentative dates for upcoming work sessions over the summer. We're looking at a work session in June, I believe on the 16th, which would be sort of an overview of the process that we have so far. And
June 19th.
June 19th, thank you. And then another in July where we would sit down with the committees and look more specifically at their recommendations. And then additionally, following up on that discussion in early September, coming back to and having a council work session on next steps. We will be, the city will be closing the tree survey on May 31st. So if you haven't had a chance to take that and share your thoughts regarding the tree ordinance and tree canopy in the city, I do encourage people to go ahead and do that. I think they've had about 300 and some responses so far, which is pretty good, but it'd be great to hear from more people as well. And then finally, I attended the TPB meeting today, the Transportation Planning Board meeting, and as I noted earlier, and there were a couple of interesting things. We've been going through having DDOT, MDOT, and VDOT to give presentations on their efforts at reducing fatalities and serious injuries in their states. And so we heard from Virginia and the district, and this month we heard from MDOT. And I think they have a lot of good plans, but my sense overall was that it's a little frustrating the level that they're focusing on behavioral aspects of accidents in terms of distracted driving and aggressive driving rather than infrastructure improvements. So I'm looking forward to them. The legislature passed a bill that will change the current Toward Zero Deaths initiative that they have to a Vision Zero. And I'm looking forward to seeing kind of the outcomes of that. And that might have implications as they move towards developing some new plans for things like we're talking about in terms of safety on our roads. So I think they're moving in the right direction, and I've seen some really interesting work and useful work focused on improved pedestrian safety, but it still seems like there's a little ways to go in terms of how they're looking at things.
Ms. Costick, earlier today you mentioned that about 60% of the accidents were infrastructure-related accidents, not distracted driving or other kinds.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really, really surprised to see that. And it is, accidents can apparently be classified in two different ways. So they can be classified as behavioral related and also infrastructure related, but I think you still have to account for infrastructure even if it is behavioral related. So it was, about more than 60% of those accidents were related to infrastructure.
And infrastructure they define as like the street or like...
It's a little loosely defined, yeah. The sort of the built structure, I guess. So in terms of the way an intersection is configured, the guardrails, it could be light, signals, the whole range of things. So I think that's something to find out a little more from them on as well. We didn't have a chance for a thorough discussion because our meeting had run late on another topic. So I think we're going to hear from them again in about 3 months. We're going through a cycle of having each of the DOTs come back and present to us 3 times. So we're going to hear back from Virginia and the district again in the next 2 months, and then Maryland will be back again. So if anyone has questions or thoughts you want to pass along for those meetings, I'm happy to ask questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm waiting for her to continue. Councilwoman Searcy. Sorry.
Real quick, just want to thank everyone that came out last Saturday to the Spring Fest. We had a great time. We were dancing in the rain, and the thing that was so funny is we called it, right? So it was called. It was like, no more. Let's stop the band. It's raining. Thanks. We lasted as long as we could. And then the minute the song ended, the rain stopped. It's like, see? But we had a fantastic time. So I really want to thank the Crossroads Community Development Authority and others who are part of putting that activity together. It was great fun, and definitely look forward to having conversations about ways in which perhaps we could start thinking about Ann Street not just as a temporary cutoff, but as a viable public space for the ward. So definitely want to start having conversations as we're talking about public space, and specifically about ways in which we may be able to use streets like Ann Street in a more permanent way. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith?
Okay, a number of things to talk about. First, I want to thank the residents from Ward 1 for coming out. I want to lend my support to Councilmember Kovar for a future letter, so you don't have to worry about me. I'm on board.
That, anyway.
Yes. I just want to let people know that in June 18th, there will be a Sligo View resident meeting. I have invited Grace Wiggins and the police chief to talk to the residents. This is an MHP property on Houston Avenue. Tomorrow we have the MML chapter meeting. It will be hosted by Gaithersburg. Many of you probably saw the nominating committee's recommendations. It's basically the same slate as last year, and I'm up for re-election as the district vice president. Couple other things. The Alexa project that is going to be part of the MML conference in Ocean City is going forward. We have found a coder to build out the Alexa portion of Amazon's presentation for us, so you will be able to ask some questions to Alexa, and hopefully she will be able to answer them. I had a conference call with our keynotes this week, Dr. Beatrice Berry. She's going to be fantastic. If you get a chance, look her up on YouTube. She's an incredible, dynamic woman. And this is the first time the league has ever had a black woman as their keynote speaker. And finally, sponsorship dollars are 46% over last year, and we are not done taking in money. Thank you very much.
Councilwoman DeBala.
Yeah, a few things. I'm assuming that the city manager is going to talk about Celebrate Tacoma, assuming people want to hear about the next party.
Do it.
Well, yeah, I had a great time at the Crossroads last weekend. And this Saturday on Maple Avenue from 4 to 7 is Celebrate Tacoma, which is the street party festival focused on the diversity of music, arts, food in our city, and entertainment. It'll be a lot of fun. I also wanted to, before we started the council meeting, we had a great reception, and I met a lot of Ward 2 residents who are serving on committees, councils, and boards, and I wanted to thank all of you for doing that, and especially I am grateful for the positive energy that you all bring. It's just refreshing to be around so many people who are bringing that kind of energy to our community. This must be Regional Week because the Chesapeake Bay Policy Council is meeting Friday, so I'll be chairing that, and next Wednesday the Climate and Energy group from COG is meeting. I'll also be doing a Montgomery Housing Partnership tour on tomorrow, at the Bonifant in Silver Spring, so I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, and last but not least, I'm sorry the resident who brought up Lincoln Avenue isn't here. I would like to follow up on this. My understanding was that there were two things that were going to happen, and one was that there was a letter going out to the residents. I thought it went out, explaining some of the details of the project in plain English, and particularly the schedule. And I also understood that WSSC was going to give some kind of explanation about the water. What I had been told was that when the pipe was cut, that's a very typical thing that happens, that the water is brown for a bit,
Yes.
for a few hours, for maybe overnight, and then it clears up. So if it's not cleared up, then I would like somebody in that stretch of Aspen Avenue to tell me. But I have not heard anything about it in several days.
Yes,
So
I was
could you
briefed on it
please-
today. And basically, that line was not marked. Our contractors cut the water line. The thing that was fascinating was that it didn't go out on the street. It went immediately from the hole where they cut it into the storm drain. So it was the cleanest water main break you could get. WSSC came out very promptly. The water was out in the neighborhood for about 2 hours.
Yeah, they are
And
supposed to be letting people know, though, when that kind of, WSSC.
They did send
when that
out,
kind
they
of
sent
thing-
out a message.
Okay.
And so I don't know that everybody got it, but I do know that WSSC did send out a message. I saw it. And everything that I understand about Lincoln Avenue was the project is going along just as it was planned. But I also understand that there were some people who were upset about some aspects, and I'm happy to follow up with them or you at any time.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. First, I would like to follow up on Councilmember Smith's comments, and I would ask that Councilmember Kovar worry about me. So
I do all the time, don't worry.
I just would like to see you use all of your persuasive powers as we look at the State Highway Authority. I just wanted to comment, since Councilmember Costick had mentioned a crosswalk issue in her ward, that I know I've mentioned this several times throughout my years on the council, that residents of Ward 4 continue to be concerned about the crosswalk on Piney Branch Road at Ritchie Avenue. And I know that State Highway Authority has in the past looked at that and has insisted that there is no need for worry there, but there is, and maybe we can be a little bit more deliberative in the way that we approach that when we're looking at a whole package of things. Thank you.
Councilmember Kovar?
Thank you, and thanks again to the Philadelphia people. The one other thing I want to make, and I'll just, point I want to make, and I'll mention for the city manager, of the items that they mentioned, the paving of the sidewalk maybe falls more within our control than SHA's, and so I know it's early because we're just getting into the budget year and so on, but if we can potentially get timing on whether that stretch that they mentioned by the park there is due to be paved and what the timing would look like, that would be helpful. And then a couple of other things. Councilmember Costick mentioned the paving through Pepco of Eastern Avenue, and I think that's positive news. I've also asked them, and they say they're getting back to me, but for folks who are from North Tacoma who are wondering whether the most unpaved bad part of Tacoma Avenue, due to the Pepco project, could also at least get a partial smoothing until the project's completed. They're supposedly looking into, so there's a lot of paving questions around the ward. I just want to say to my constituents in the crowd. And then the one other thing in terms of Pepco, and I did send this to our staff today and also to Pepco and to the contractor, but the gentleman who lives in the house at the corner of our little short section of Eastern Avenue and Piney Branch, at 6 p.m. they were still working there when he came home. And he mentioned that they're often working till 5. I know sometimes there are emergencies, as for example, when there's a water main break or whatever it is, or something that happens that they don't anticipate. And I think typically they had agreed that they would try to let us know if there was something specific that was happening that was keeping them working late. But generally, the expectation, I think, has been that by 3:30 or 4, they're knocking off. So I haven't heard back from the contractor or from Pepco or our staff about that. And it was fairly late in the day, so maybe there's been an answer since then. But if you could check on that, both specifically for today, because the gentleman came home from work at 6 o'clock and couldn't get into his driveway. And that was tonight. Now, they did get him in, but I think it was surprising and not what you expect when you come home that late. So thank you.
Great. All right, and I would just like to acknowledge that this is National Police Week. I know the city manager had it in her comments. I just want to say this is a time where we honor our officers and the sacrifices they make to serve our communities, and we remember those who have lost their lives in the line of duty. And I just want to say thank you to our police department for all the hard work that they do and all our staff. So I'll turn it over to the city manager now for her comments.
Thank you. And I know today is the more solemn of the days of the week when they have the ceremonies at the memorial in downtown DC. And so we've had a lot of our officers participate in getting people to the ceremony that come in from the airports and otherwise show their support. One of the things that we did this evening with the celebration of our committee members was to celebrate our youth council. And we need more members of the youth council. It's that time. So this is going to be one where the kids really do age out, and you need to keep replacing them. And so please, we urge residents in Tacoma Park in grades 7 to 12 to apply. The council will appoint up to 11 members in July, and they will take office in September. The application deadline is June 28th, and the application is on the city website. And please get the word out to prospective youth council members. I will say that this is not just something to write on your college application. The folks do marvelous work. It's energizing to watch them. And so if somebody wants to go to a meeting where they really help and do good things, joining the youth council is a great option. I want to note, especially for Councilmember Smith, that there's a delay in the Flower Avenue work and why. The first phase of the Flower Avenue Green Street project is WSSC work. Apparently, it's not that easy to go from one wing of WSSC to the other in handing off from design to construction. And so there's materials approvals that have to take place, and there's been a delay in that. I will say that Nima of our staff is dogged in finding who's not signing off on things quickly enough. And, you know, if it doesn't hear, she goes to the next level of the supervisor. So that seems to be pushing it. You may want to help as well to make sure that that gets back on task. What it does, the delay is considered a city delay for the purposes of our contractor. So we don't like that. And so we're trying to move things along. Our contractor will go out and start doing some saw cutting in the roadway on Friday to keep the process moving. But just, this is one of those really annoying things when it's our fault, but it's not our fault. And would like to make sure that that moves right along.
And let me just say, as soon as I saw that, I sent an email to the Director of Government Relations asking her to move this forward.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Want to note that sharrows are being installed on Cedar Avenue and in the community center parking lot. In my page that I passed out for my city manager comments, I got a picture of one I snapped today, so you get a sense of what the new version looks like. They're very bright lime green. Wanted to note though, so this is part of Bike Month. We're trying to do a number of efforts to encourage people to bike and to identify the bike routes throughout the community. You know, the county has identified bike routes, but we haven't necessarily labeled them. We've got a new bike map that's out now, so we're having ways to try to share that information. But one of the ways that we share it is to put sharrows on streets where it's easy, you don't need a bike lane, but it's an opportunity to share the road with bikers. We investigated a number of things for Bike Month, permanent and pop-up installations. Some of the pop-up ideas were too expensive, so we were not able to move forward on that. We had a lot of conversations about them that were exciting. One component, though, were permanent bike sharrows on the city parking lot and then onto Cedar Avenue. Unfortunately, we did not close the loop with council members or the residents on Cedar Avenue that we were installing the sharrows, and I want to apologize for that. That's not our practice, and no one likes to have a surprise in front of their homes. I do think that they are good. There was a lot of attention to not having the placement of them where you would see them down a lead rock, so you just look right out your house and see them, first thing. But anyway, I do want to apologize that we dropped the ball on communications, and Councilmember Kovar, I do apologize for that.
Could I ask a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
So, thank you for that. I think there's two questions. There's the process, and so we didn't really have that, and I heard about it just from the staff the day before, as we talked about. But I think there wasn't the level of engagement that we normally would have had for
That's
something
right.
like this. And so, one person that I heard from just sent me a couple of concerns, and I could pass this email along to you. But the point that she's raising is that typically when there's a bike lane, it's green, but usually the showers are white.
They've
And
changed the standard.
So.
Apparently, they've changed the standard, so this is the new standard.
Okay, well, I'll pass it on, we can get that. The other thing is, and I've noticed this myself, but I just walked by there today because I was going up to Busboys and Poets. There's a lot of clogging on that last block of Cedar, and parking from people who shouldn't be parking there because it's near the commercial area, and/or to avoid the utility work that we talked about before. And so it's kind of narrow for bicycles and cars to actually share the space. And again, we weren't really able to have that discussion. So that does concern me. So I'm going to pass this
Please
on
do.
to you. And I don't know. I mean, is there something different that we should do
Well, we
about
should
these
do it the
kinds of
right way,
projects?
so I didn't do it the right way, we should do it the right way. We did not follow our normal procedures.
Okay.
And so can I just ask one question? So this is going to be the design we'll see all over the city going forward?
Where there are sharrows,
right.
yeah.
Okay. And that includes Flower Avenue? There will be sharrows on Flower Avenue?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'll
All
have
right.
to find out.
Okay, thank
So
you.
the other thing, if you can check on,
Uh-huh.
we have the streetscape situation, streetscape guidelines, we have historic districts. Does any of that apply to this? Because again, we never talked about this.
Right. I don't think it does,
Okay,
but
if you can check and-
I'd like to be very
Yeah.
careful about it.
Okay.
And like I said, there were lots of surprises on
Okay.
this.
You referred to a new bike map, and if you
Yes.
could get that around in
It
some
just came
format
in, I
that
think,
we could-
today. So
that we
we're
could get
happy
it.
to share them. It's very exciting.
Yeah, great, thank you.
I also forgot to mention that Friday is Bike to Work Day.
That's
and
right.
there are 2 pit stops in Tacoma Park,
That's
one in
right.
Old Town and one on Sligo Creek by New Hampshire.
So please bike to work. The next thing I'd like to give is a clarification regarding the SHA vision process and related to information about the NDC conference call. So there's 2 different things on this item, and it's a little bit jumbled here. I'm sorry, I'll clean this up. There was a conference call related to the NDC Tacoma Junction project, and as part of that, the notes from that conference call stated that the upcoming May 21st HPC meeting is a public meeting. However, as a consultation, it will not include public comments. However, public comments are permitted at the HPC preliminary consultation meetings. We would appreciate that it was pointed out to us by residents. We made a correction on the notes. We didn't note that we made a correction, so that's something that we should do. But it is in fact correct, and the HPC preliminary consultation meeting will be fairly significant. So next Tuesday evening, that will be a major activity. At the same time, there's also a meeting for businesses in the Tacoma Junction area to talk about deliveries and other kinds of needs that they have as part of the SHA vision process. One of the comments that I've also received related to the SHA vision process is that an assertion that city staff have not been involved in promoting information about it or in assisting the project manager for that, and that's not true. We've been sharing information on that all along, and I'm in regular contact with Kenties Holford, who is the project manager. We have multiple discussions about locations for meetings. We've offered as a city facilities. They've chosen not to do that, which is their right. They have some particular things that they look for. They've run surveys past us, and we've shared surveys. And I've met with her on a number of occasions, or if there needs to be some other kind of a detailed meeting, we've had those detailed meetings. I am excited about the SHA vision process as a concept. The big item that's coming up are 2 meetings in June, which you should register for if you'd like to attend. They're going to be held at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Old Town. And what this, the first meeting will be on kind of setting a vision statement, I think, and the second will be more a charrette type meeting. That's my understanding. If you register online, which is the way you need to do, unfortunately it's awkward. You have to pick which day you're going, and if you want to go to both, you have to get out and then go back in to pick both. I have been told you don't have to be at both, but it also sounds like it's a good idea to be at both if you're interested in the project.
What are the dates again?
Oh, I don't have them in front of me. Somehow I want to say June 10th and 11th. I think it's June 10th and 11th.
Could you clarify the HPC meeting?
Yeah, it's
the 21st.
The HPC meeting. I'm going to correct this
Okay.
when we post
I
it.
just wanted to make sure I had it.
Yes, the HPC meeting is the 21st. So, in any event, a lot of interaction with us, a lot of interest in seeing that the roadways work well for us, just as we've had a lot of discussions tonight about state highways. The state highways in the Junction area do need improvement, and they need to be able to accommodate deliveries for the businesses or the other kinds of business services that are required. So looking
There's
forward to
also
that.
an online survey
There is an online survey that is open now. Please fill that out as well.
for people who can't make the meeting, especially.
Yes, I would hope many people do the online survey. Again, it's not that easy to figure out on the SHA website where to do it, but if you do look at the city's website links to it or the social media links to it, it gets right to the survey, so it's easier to do that. I think that's it. I will make a correction to this document
And
when we
then-
post it, yeah.
Great.
Am I the only one that got the postcard in the mail today?
Yes, they're sending out postcards,
So,
yeah.
stay tuned, and then it has all the information on it.
All right, now
Now we get to have fun.
Now we get to talk about parking management project. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Grinsby to walk us through where we are on this.
We do have a PowerPoint for this as well, but some really interesting information and an ask from you.
Yes. We are actually going to start with a clip of Donald Shoup, who is kind of the parking guru. He published a book in 2005 called The High Cost of Free Parking, and has since kind of shifted. There's been a sea change in how planners have been talking about parking for probably the last 15 years. Do I just start from here? Okay.
Land is expensive for housing, but it's free for parking. And you wonder why we have a problem?
Parking requirements often result in more parking space than building space, pushing buildings further apart from each other, making it harder to walk, and encouraging more driving. Many of the dense cities that we love, like Paris or Washington, D.C., or Amsterdam or New York, wouldn't look like this with parking requirements. These arbitrary rules continue to shape the growth of our cities and increase traffic congestion. But the excessive amount of land dedicated to parking is able to be repurposed.
We have a terrific opportunity to convert underused parking lots into housing where people want to live. The upside is that we have a lot of benefits to reap from changing our policies. Well, to boil an 800-page book down into 3 bullet points, I have 3 basic recommendations. Remove off-street parking requirements, charge the right price for on-street parking, by which I mean the lowest price the city can charge, and still have 1 or 2 open spaces on every block. So nobody can say there's a shortage of parking. In order to reach that price, you have to vary it by location and time of day. But once you've done that, and make it politically popular and spend the revenue on public services on the metered streets. Well, I'm worn out.
trying to get out of this and into my PowerPoint. Sorry. Thank you. Great, thank you. Is it up on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, it's not yet
Yeah,
up
I think
on
it's getting there.
It'll be
There you
there.
go.
So we're talking about the parking management plan tonight. We have been working on this for many years, as you know. We've been before you many times. And I think we're ready to kind of talk about the next step. Tonight I want to reframe how we think about parking. That's why we used the clip from Donald Shoup to start with. So I like this quote: "Who pays for free parking? Everyone but the motorist." His point is that the costs are dispersed among everyone else, but the motorist parking on the curb at that spot is not necessarily paying. But housing people, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's dispersed in many ways invisibly of how we pay for that parking. I think the conversation has really shifted nationwide to talk about it in balance with other competing demands for the space. And it's also shifted to things we didn't talk about at all in the past. Instead of minimum parking limits, we're talking about maximum parking limits. And instead of a standard parking rate, as he mentioned, a market demand rate that can fluctuate. We have technology that's pushing that, especially in big cities with a bigger budget to make some of the parking changes apps that can tell you where there's an available parking space at any moment in San Francisco, for instance, or things like that. We're talking about demand variable parking, and so there are many ways of phrasing it, but just there's no such thing as free parking, just as there's no such thing as a free lunch. And what we've done in the past is really hide that aspect. The link here, and this will be available on the city website for the council materials as well, but it's to a longer 6-minute clip you may have seen of Donald Shoup going into more detail about some of his work. We have spent the last 70 years or more designing around cars, and that process has shaped cities. We've shaped cities around cars, including our own. And what we've discovered is that individuals make their transportation decisions based on essentially these 5 factors. This is not necessarily in order, but it might be. People look at time, convenience, cost, reliability, and safety. And for the last decade, 70 years or more, we have prioritized cars and, by virtue of that, parking over other means, so that when people make this calculation in many times and in many areas, the answer that comes out on top is a single occupancy vehicle, driving and parking. And parking is actually just a form of storage for cars. Cars actually spend most of their time not driving, but actually sitting. And so it's shaped not only our cities, but ourselves. Our behaviors are around that. Parking impacts everything. It impacts decisions that are made about land use, housing affordability, climate change, health and activity, air pollution, traffic congestion, access and equity, and economic development. Parking requirements and costs and demand and use shape all of those factors of how we think of cities and how we live together as communities. We are reframing the conversation. We want to talk about parking as a public asset. Curbside parking is public property, and the goal of parking management is to think about how to use public assets well for the community as a whole. And I put this graphic image up just as a rough measure. So the consultants from COG that did work for us a few years ago estimated that in the residential parking permit zones, which of course is a fairly small part of the city, we have 4.5 acres devoted to parking, curbside parking. And just as a measure of what that looks like, the city-owned largest park is Spring Park, which is 3 acres. We talked briefly in the fall about what the goals need to be, how to think about and put out there to improve the use of the public right-of-way in terms of not just parking, but the broader use of the public right-of-way. And so we raised questions of sustainability considerations, climate change, racial equity, social equity and accessibility, safe and convenient pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, and the use of public transit. We also outlined questions to consider. How do we prioritize the space? And how does the city as a whole and as a community want to think about these detailed questions of how we manage the space? The recommendation that we're putting forward tonight is the formation of a parking management committee. We had not talked about this in the fall as next steps, but the more we dug into some of the details, and I'll explain why, it seems like this makes sense as the next step. And we just outlined a few points of how council might want to consider it if you're setting up a committee. It can serve as an ad hoc committee, have representation from all wards, make sure there's representation from single-family homeowners as well as multifamily unit residents, include the business community, include the relevant city committees, the ones that came to mind for us were Committee on the Environment and the reconstituted Safe Roadways or Safe Mobility. I believe that name is changing. But we thought it was a way to get people to roll up their sleeves and engage in the process and kind of serve as a focus group for some of the ideas that staff would like to put forward, serve as a sounding board for their networks and neighborhoods to bring back to the conversation and move it forward to the next step beyond this. As a quick recap, we have done a lot of work to date. We've been working on parking management since 2015. And I'm happy to go into more detail, but I think you're familiar with all these things. I'm really putting it in as a reminder. We did get sidelined at one point with other projects and other council priorities, so now we're back into looking at parking management in a more significant way. The biggest takeaway from public engagement is that where you stand depends on where you sit. I mean, this is not new information, and I'm sure as council members you're very familiar with this. We heard a lot about a handful of very specific issues of availability, enforcement, crunch times or crunch areas, what we have called hotspots, residential parking permit zones and all their complexities, signage. You can see here, I don't know if you can read about, everything from we need more bikes to the residential permit zones hours aren't right to all kinds of things. We've also heard on the same issue from people on the same block opposite perspectives. There's plenty of parking, it's no problem. There's never enough parking, it's a disaster. We love the residential permit zone. It's a hassle and we don't want it, and if we could carve out our block, we'd be happy to. So there's a wide range of perspective. Really the challenges that we've identified are that parking hasn't really been managed in the city as a comprehensive system. I think especially the residential parking permit zones, it's easy to see that it's kind of evolved as residents have gotten organized and stepped up, or as pressures have developed, but we haven't looked at it as a whole in the city. Balancing the interface between residential and commercial districts is very important. Another challenge is both the real and perceived parking constraints and how that may discourage residents or visitors from patronizing our local businesses. And the people who would like to use other forms of transportation, walking, biking, taking transit, don't always because they don't necessarily feel safe or it doesn't feel convenient to them. So we're very aware of those challenges and the balances between them. Again, I think I covered this. This is just an example that when we asked if parking should be allowed in the neighborhood during the day, we got really almost exactly diametrically opposed answers. Yes, the green is yes in both Old Town and Tacoma Park. Parking should be allowed in the neighborhoods. The purple is, so 37%. 38% said no for both Old Town and Tacoma Park. 3% said yes only in one, 3% said yes and only in the other, and 19% neither agreed nor disagreed with the statement. So where you stand depends on where you sit. People really have very different experiences. We checked the residential survey that was released early this year, and one of the questions was if parking is a problem in your neighborhood. And 69% said it's not a problem or it's only a minor problem. 17% said moderate, 9% said a major problem, and 5% said it's an extreme problem, in all capital letters. And so it's not necessarily what you'd expect, but it does reveal that it's very granular. It depends exactly on which block and what the issues are, and those are different from one aspect of the city to another, and there isn't any one solution. To just pull out one specific issue of the residential parking permit zones, I mention it because I know that they are scattered throughout the city, and I know council members hear residents' concerns and perhaps requests for them. We put a GoPro camera on our intern and sent him out through zones 1, 1A, 2, 2A, and 4, middle of the day, middle of the week, to check out what it looked like. And what it looked like was that the streets were fairly empty. And so if we think of the goal of parking management to use public assets well, that may not demonstrate that they're being used well. So I just put that in there to give you a sense. We actually have the YouTube video up there. He's on a bike, so it's a little vibrating, and you can see for yourself as he rides up and down streets what he sees. I didn't want you to think I was cherry picking by showing one photo that I actually took today of empty streets. There are a lot of uses for curbside space. So we have not only residential parking needs, but we have customer parking that would turn over frequently. We have needs for bike lanes. We have needs for better pedestrian amenities, as we are very conscious of. And we have needs for community public spaces. So if you think about the amount of property that belongs to the city, public land, that's devoted to parking, it opens up possibilities to think creatively about other aspects. So these are topics really that came out of the deep dive staff has done over the period of a few years of our analysis as well as community input on kinds of things that seem like they would make sense. And they're really things we'd love to have a committee look at and dig into deeply. I won't read the list. I'm happy to answer questions on any specific if you want to get in the weeds, but I think the critical things we're highlighting are meter rates. There's a huge discrepancy between DC and Maryland. Parking permits, what that means for people who are in the zone and not in the zone, and what that means for parts of the city that residents don't have access to easily park in other neighborhoods. We know there are commercial delivery issues. We know there are enforcement and administration issues. So we just kind of put together a list of ideas that we have that we think would be a useful starting point. And lastly, we just circled it back to the council's priorities. Parking really does hit every single one of these. And so I wanted to put it in a bigger context to say, we think this matters to the community. We think this matters to you. We think they're compelling reasons to keep going with it. Open to questions.
If I can just say a few words. One is the staff worked really, really hard on this, so they have an enormous amount of data. They have lots of examples of different permit parking systems or other kind of systems that other communities use. So it's a great opportunity to, if you would choose to appoint a committee, to sit down and say, and to spend the time and go through it and say, does this make sense? And then for that committee to help identify, should there be some focus groups or some other kind of targeted public outreach that could respond to these various ideas. So I just want you to you know, I really appreciated kind of the overview approach, but we have a lot of data. Love
I
to share
didn't
it.
want to go too deep into into all the numbers and the weeds, but it's true, we do have a lot, and it was a little hard to figure out how to consolidate that into a presentation tonight.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you very much. And as you know, I circulated to my colleagues a blog I wrote in 2014 that highlighted Professor Shoup and his work, and I can't believe it's almost 5 years ago. And so I'm excited that we're at this place and we're continuing to move this forward. I'm very supportive of the ad hoc committee to help assist move this forward. And I also want to just plant a seed in thinking about one of the things I thought was very successful that we've done over the last few months is when we had the, I guess it was all day presentation, then discussion on the tree canopy. And so we had the gentleman from the University of Vermont come, do a presentation in the morning, answer questions. We broke for lunch, and then in the afternoon, a group of us got together and discussed what do the findings mean and how do we move forward and do all that. And I would suggest, given the amount of data you do have, that having some kind of format like that, once the ad hoc committee is formed, if my colleagues agree with that, that might be a great kickoff to it. It would also be an opportunity for other members of the public to come and participate in the morning, and then let the committee and possibly some council members then dig in the afternoon. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Grisby, for the presentation. I do support the ad hoc committee. I think that's a good idea. I hope they'll take a long range look at what parking looks like throughout the city, because I think, you know, with the pressures going on for development in DC and Prince George's County, you know, parking is going to be an even bigger issue for us. One thing that I would like to see is the ad hoc committee work with DDOT, DC's Department of Transportation, and see what their plans are, if they have any changes. One thing that I did find intriguing in your report was the idea of everyone having a parking pass in the city, that whatever that cost was, $12 and change. Can you talk more about that? Is there any other places in the country with municipalities our size that have done something like that? And how do you handle the equity question for those people that can't afford a parking pass? And I got a couple more questions.
The idea would be a citywide pass, that if you live in the city of Tacoma Park, you're eligible to have a parking pass that would allow you to park anywhere in the city in Tacoma Park. And actually, the equity issues were part of what pushed us in this direction, recognizing that the current parking permit zones tend to be single-family homeowners, and there tend to be discrepancies in the demographics between who lives in single-family homes and who lives in the multifamily home areas, and that it doesn't make sense to say you live in Tacoma Park to me. So I'm revealing my bias. You know, you live in Tacoma Park, but you can't park elsewhere in the city. There's an exclusionary element of it,
right.
And the current price. So to be clear, it would be that people would be eligible for it. They would not be required to have it. If you have off-street parking and you don't need anything more than that, then that's fine. That works for you. And our focus would be on what we've identified as the hot spots, the blocks closest to the commercial area, the metro station, the college. It may be the Purple Line. I mean, that may end up being a hot spot depending on how that takes shape. That there would be metered parking. I don't mean a parking meter at every spot down the street, but probably we would use Park Mobile like we do now, so that it would turn over and it would be ideally priced to maintain one or two open spots at the street virtually at all time, but that there would be a way of managing that prime real estate that is now a pressure point. And the $12.50 is what it is now. We don't think that even covers the administrative cost. So what we'd like to think about, and I don't have a definitive answer under state of Maryland law, but we'd like to have the first vehicle be a lower amount and the second vehicle in that household have a higher price tag to get a permit, and successive vehicles would also be more expensive. So a way of kind of saying it's a privilege and it's available to you, but it will cost more as you have more cars. Trying to weave in our concerns about sustainability and climate change and the bigger context that we want to be talking about in the process.
And so, one area that I would like the committee to look at is the Washington Adventist Hospital campus and what that means. And the press release we've seen from Washington Adventist University saying they want to buy the campus. How does that change parking, if it does change parking? Another thing is, in Old Town, I've heard about, potentially closing Laurel Avenue. Like the committee to look at that, see if that, is practical. Because, like you said, if we want to promote pedestrian access, best way to do that is getting cars off the street, And, if we are really serious about the environment, making sure that, we have maybe a no car Sunday or someday during the week where we actually promote, just like we bike to work day, that we actually promote people not using their vehicles or carpooling or some other means of transportation. So I think this is a good first step in the right direction, and I look forward to the next step.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a follow-up question on, not to get too into this idea of the parking permit, but initially now, are you thinking it would be tied to the vehicle or to a household?
The way the permits work now is it's by your license plate number.
Okay.
It's you take your title in and your driver's license. But we were thinking the incentivized or disincentivized pricing structure would be by household. And we've had internal conversations of what does that mean if it's a multi-unit house, in which case each unit would be considered a separate household. What does that mean if it's a group house? And it might be a nice way to intersect making sure group houses are also registered, or houses with accessory apartments are also registered, that there may be some synergies that we can work on with that, and ways of thinking of them certainly as accessory apartments, as separate units, just as separate households, just as we would for multi-unit.
Mayor, the question actually is indicative of how much in the weeds you can get.
Yeah.
And why I finally said, let's just bring what we've got to this group.
Yeah.
Because there's always some interesting tweak to it.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on the current permitting process. So my understanding is if there are residents on a particular street who want to make their street permit only, the petition process, all of that jazz happens. And then I thought that they needed to, in essence, have a license plate number and everything to get a permit, but also some sort of address to link them to the actual street. So it wouldn't solely be license plate alone. There's also a household element to that.
Yes.
Okay.
That currently is, yes.
Right. That's what I thought. Okay. Perfect.
And then just to close the loop on that, it's actually by council ordinance that the parking permit, residential parking permit area is established.
Okay.
So it's, the petition is the beginning of the process.
Okay. Great.
You're up next.
Oh, awesome.
Keep going.
Thank you so much for this. I'm extremely interested in the topic for a number of reasons. Not only the Purple Line, but I also have a number of multi-unit buildings that have shortage of parking. And as we are thinking about increased density and the fact that there are some requirements that kind of lessen the number of parking spaces that may be available for multifamily buildings, and especially those that may perhaps be located in areas where there aren't a lot of metered parking spaces available, because we're talking about state highway. The idea of permit that would be universal, be it for the entire city or for the ward in which you live, I would definitely be open to having those conversations. In terms of a committee or an ad hoc committee, one question I have is we're having conversations now about the newly named, but I forgot what the new name would be, Safe Streets for all the community. I don't know. But to me, this seems to be a topic that wouldn't be a one and done. This would seem to be a topic that would make sense to fall up under the purview of that particular committee. So does it make sense to come up with another ad hoc committee, or does it make sense to try to use this particular topic as a way to increase participation in a committee that is supposed to be looking at roadways and things and is currently dealing with the shortage of people being willing to participate? So that's one question that I have, because they came to us and expressed that they're having issues with recruiting and retaining committee members. And so to ask for more work and to form another committee where we're asking a committee that doesn't have enough people to support it, to me seems kind of somewhat counterintuitive.
If I can just add into that, we certainly wanted to have some representation from them. But because there are other aspects also that aren't really about safe roadways or even safe mobility involved in here, in particular, we were looking at Committee on the Environment membership because some of these areas may be better suited for bioretention facilities as opposed to parking. Or, how do we accomplish, meet some sustainability things? The other thing that we were hoping, I'm not ruling out using them, but the other thing that I was hoping is that there's a time limit to this work. And so whatever committee or organization structure that you want, I would strongly urge that there's a time limit so we at least get something down and make some changes and get those in place. And then it may be clearly an ongoing topic, but not at that intensity.
I mean, I would argue, though, that what you are starting to describe is more like a committee around public placemaking. So it's not just about parking, but also how could we use the spaces that we're currently using for parking in other ways that may, be it bioretention, be it public placemaking, be it something else, some other land use.
Yeah, we're actually, right now, we're really looking a little bit more at parking management. So I mentioned bioretention to keep that in mind, but it really is parking management. What are meter rates? What is a permit system? What do we do with those particular hot spots? And I can name the people who have the house near a commercial district and don't have a driveway. Yep. And, what is that specific thing so that we can check those things off the list and get a long way towards some of these other questions. So we're open to whatever structure seems most appropriate.
Yeah.
And I was just going to build on that. I also think I'd like to see us move on this, and I think if this Safe Streets Committee was up and running and had I don't know, I feel like they're reconstituting themselves. They actually have a number of things they want to be working on. And I see this group, as the city manager just said, working very intensely for a short amount of time. So I also don't know if currently the 3 members of the Safe Streets Committee, as they're, building up and rebuilding that committee, would want to take whatever we think it's going to be the next 3 to 5 months and just focus on this. So that would be my other concern. Because as they're looking at long term. And I also really like the idea of having businesses in part of this and a good cross-section of people. So it may be, I don't know, I'm wondering if there's something about focusing on this and then maybe some of the folks would move over. And I'm actually thinking maybe start here as a group that works really intensely, and then this might be a good place to help recruit for the Safe Streets, and so people who want to then continue on a committee, maybe that's a good pathway there.
So kind of bait and switch.
Basically,
gotcha.
Keep going. Especially if we're proposing to have the 3 members that are part of the SAFE committee be a part of this committee.
Right.
So that's why I'm like, well, then why not just
Right, and then maybe recruit some other people, so hopefully then they feed into that, yeah, or something like that, but, yeah.
and so I think I think that's something that we should definitely think through, especially as we're talking about creating more ad hoc when we know that there may be some other groups that are having challenges with recruiting and retaining folks. And lastly, I want to make sure that we're not losing sight of the fact that although it's very clear when you ride around during the day that there's a lot of space in terms of parking. The parking problems don't happen until night when everyone's at home.
Right.
And so while it makes sense to think through perhaps alternative uses of some of the space during the day, we need to keep in mind that many of our residents do not have driveways. We're actually encouraging them to not have driveways or to not build driveways. And so when we're thinking through the parking policies, or even when we're outlining the data of what the problem is, we don't want there to be this disillusion that people are not using cars here. A lot of people are using cars. But they go to work, they actually drive to the metro. I'm gonna be honest, I will admit the error of my ways. You don't see a lot of cars on the street because of the way the Tacoma Metro is set up. You can't park there and work a full 8-hour shift. So a lot of people, some take the bus, but a lot of people actually get in their cars and drive. And they may drive to Fort Totten, or they may drive to Prince George's Plaza and get on the Metro to go to DC or wherever they gotta go. So during the day, you don't see cars.
Right.
But you drive up at 3:45, 4 o'clock, and the streets are full of people. So I do think that it's important for us to think through not just parking from the perspective of what's happening during the day, but also when people are at home and when street parking is scarcest.
Right, so there's a couple of things. One is, with the adoption of the budget, it does create the full-time parking enforcement officer that can do more night enforcement. And so we're looking forward to having that. But part of the specificity of a parking plan or parking meters is this sense about when is it operative, when is parking encouraged, and when is it discouraged. Because in many places, it would be great if the parking spaces on the streets are busy during the day and they magically go away, so just when you come home, you can have a space. And, can we divide it like that? Can we devise an answer that gets people to that kind of a shared use?
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kostick.
Thank you. I'll expose my inner nerd, but I'm like super excited about the idea of going to a day-long workshop on this. Seems like a lot of fun. There's some really interesting things about this. And I don't think there are a lot of easy answers. I think there's trade-offs depending on what you do. One thing that I would like to see emphasized a little more in here or thought about is the fact that getting people out of cars and off-street parking, into transit is going to ultimately be a goal we want to aim for, and it would reduce the things that people are concerned about in terms of traffic volume and traffic speeds overall. And I know some of that is impacted by cars coming from outside of Tacoma Park, but I think the more that we incentivize people taking transit to go to our commercial centers or to go to the metro, the better our community will be overall in terms of feel and safety. I also think it might be useful to look into kind of identifying some broad goals in terms of sort of overall outcomes that we want, because I think we can look at specific things that we might consider, like the idea of a citywide permit or increasing prices, but I think it might be better to approach it from what we want to achieve rather than the specific strategies. And sorry, did you have some of this?
I had
they're kind of generic, but it's,
Yeah,
we
turn
did,
them into
let's go
sentences or something.
right there. I mean,
Yeah. I guess I'm thinking taking that and moving to the level of like one of them might be getting people, incentivizing people to use transit when it's a feasible route for them, or allowing for parking for residents who live in that area within a block of their home, or things like that that we might specifically want to seek in the overall plan that we devise, because I think that might inform whether or not some of those things make sense or not. I was also wondering, is a part of this going to be looking into the total number of parking spots that you feel is needed in the city? And I know that's hard, based on what, of course, but is there a way to sort of quantify, like, here's the ideal number of spots in this location?
So I'm smiling because Donald Shoup has a clip about that as well, and he says planners have made a pseudoscience out of anticipating the number of parking spots needed based on measures that may not tell you anything about how many people choose to own cars and park in a particular location. So every household makes their own calculation on what makes sense for their needs and budget and activities. I do think that this works as a whole, that if we shift on some aspects like incentivizing transit, or conversely making it a little less easy or a little more expensive to own a car, that may help change those 5 measures I started with about it's got to be fast, it's got to be cheap, it's got to be convenient, it's got to be reliable, and oh yeah, safe is good too. And I think people make those assessments on a regular basis. Certainly anytime there's a change, new job, new school, new transit opportunity, cut in income. I mean, there are all kinds of things that incentivize it. But I also think people get up on a beautiful day and say, wow, it'd be really great to ride my bike to work today, but it's kind of scary on those streets. And so if we can shift those variables that make it feel safer. And so, part of the use for parking spots now, the daytime use might be if you could put a bike lane on some of those main streets that would connect Sligo Creek Parkway to the metro station or the Met Branch Trail, or, we're working on the new Ave bikeways on the west side. Ideally, we'd like to get riders from University to Eastern with options to go, other directions along the way. So I think the more we can move forward on those things, the more people make different individual decisions to broaden their range of options on any given day.
I think there's 2 areas where calculations have some merit. First is making sure that handicap parking is available in the right places. So there's that. The other, I think, really has to do around those particularly commercial uses that have some demand, and then you want to make sure that there's turnover and that there's adequate service for them. But it is a pull and tug kind of thing, and my husband would just be going nuts right now when you see downtown Silver Spring, where the places he liked to park are no longer there. So everybody has their system, and you've learned it, and then when when it's not there, it's really, really aggravating. And then maybe you learn the other way, to take the bus or to do something else. But it is going to be, I think having the goals will be really helpful because it gives an explanation about what we're doing, and it helps make that bike lane a more easily used thing because we're focusing on that, and it makes it a little more expensive to pay for your parking.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're taking all of that into consideration and thinking about it really holistically. I think that's really important. And I like the idea of the Safe Roadways Committee, or whatever it will be renamed, working on this. I do think it makes sense for them to be potentially separate things, but I do think there are a lot of transit and transportation related aspects to this, and that we need to keep that in mind. And hopefully the Safe Roadways Committee can be that voice for focusing on safety and transportation use and those sorts of things. A couple of other quick things. I liked that you noted, I think in the memo, electric cars and charging for people who don't have driveways. I think that's something to definitely take into consideration. And this may not directly relate to what we're talking about now, but I also think that needs to be considered in regard to multifamily buildings. Just on a personal note, my mother-in-law actually is looking into getting an electric vehicle and lives in a multifamily building and has no way to charge it. So I mean that something to look into might be creating smaller spots as well for smart cars or motorcycles, particularly in places where there might be constraints between two driveways or a fire hydrant or something like that, to just increase the number of parking spaces because you have a smaller one. That might be useful as well.
Mm-hmm. We are also very cognizant of the fact that the world's changing around us, and that parking in 10 years could look phenomenally different than it does now. And even with Uber and Lyft today, we see people making different choices because they have another tool in their toolbox. And that may start shifting some of the individual vehicle ownership as well. And I think with an aging community, there are some good options that can also help people stop driving at the appropriate time when it doesn't feel like the right thing to be doing anymore.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Great. I just want to add, when Councilwoman Kostick was talking, I just thought also we may want to be open to the idea of having non-residents on the committee, or folks who have expertise. I know there are a lot of people in Montgomery County now, in the region, who are really thinking about transportation, parking, and we might be able to tap into some of that expertise for this group as well. And I know some of our committees, we do have that, and so this might be a good thing to do for this as well. Mm-hmm. Councilmember Kovar?
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Grucci, for presenting. We're fellow Holly Avenue residents, so I appreciate that. I think I'm open to the committee idea, maybe with a representative from this, whatever the Safe Roadways will end up being called. The challenge will be making it truly representative because, as you pointed out, it goes very much block by block, and even as you mentioned, time. And I've even talked to couples where one couple will say, well, we don't have a parking problem at all on our street. When I come home at the end of the day, it's fine. And then the spouse will say, you have no idea what kind of war zone we have here during the day when you're gone. So it's block by block, but definitely time, and even within, families, there's a challenge. And then I think you mentioned, and several other people mentioned, for people who don't have driveways, it's very challenging. There's also a natural feeling, and maybe it's just our mammal nature or something, but it's hard to convince people that the space in front of their home isn't something that they have some level of attachment to. And on some relatively minor side streets where there's parking on both sides of the street, it may be relatively easy for them to do it. Where we live, there's no parking on my side of the street. I have a driveway. Sometimes I have it out there briefly on the street if I'm moving things around. But all those factors have to be taken into account, because some people say, well, of course I should be able to park in front of my house. What about all your neighbors across the street who can't? And so certainly to me, incentivizing more use of driveways when that's possible, and potentially making use of empty space during the day. I will say, in the area that I represent, on the streets that are closest to the commercial area, even during the day, you typically can't find parking spaces there. And so, yes, you can find streets that are empty when you ride around with the camera, but on the segments of kind of Maple and Willow and Cedar and so on that are close to the downtown area, they're pretty much full up all the time. I think a few other questions or points I just want to make, but you mentioned the square mileage, I guess, of the zones. Where are all the zones? I mean, or how many are there? I'm not sure we really you didn't have a map for that. Maybe you can just say kind of where they are. Not the precise boundaries, but just, where they are.
There's 6 zones. 2 are off of New Hampshire, the Kingwood Avenue area, and then off of Prince George's and Circle and that part. Those are number 5 and 6. There's one on Maplewood, which is just that stretch from Maple to Flower.
Yep.
By Washington Adventist University. And then the others, 1, 1A, 2, 2A, and 3 are all adjacent to the DC boundary line. So by the college, by the metro station, by the Old Tacoma commercial area,
Right.
you know, from basically Westmoreland over to Tacoma Ave.
So it tends to be near commercial, or in the case of the hospital, if you want to call it that, where there's a kind of competitive aspect to it as opposed to purely residential areas. I'm not sure about Kingwood if that's true.
So
but-
the
they
two
are all
along New
residential
Hampshire are to
inside.
keep the people in the apartments from parking in front of my house. That's, and there's some significant
Well,
problems.
it's, I mean, that's a pretty
Was that too blunt?
simplistic way of explaining
I'm
it.
sorry.
No, there's also, you know, there are a number of churches that would have
That's
special
right, the
events.
churches were a big
And
deal.
they would, you know, between multifamily folks having issues with parking on the various streets, in addition to some of the commercial or religious organizations having events and parking on the streets. A lot of the residents were concerned that they were no longer able to park.
And the streets are pretty restrictive, right? in
They're
there. I mean,
very
they-
narrow
and
and
they
you can
turn a
park
lot.
on both
Yeah.
sides. And so one of at least for my ward, I'm less inclined to put a lot of weight behind the number of zones, simply because it's just whichever group of residents was able to kind of understand the process enough to move it forward. What I was starting to see is more residents were starting to think about whether or not they too should have permit parking, right? Because what it actually does is pushes cars to other streets, right? So if you have some streets that are the main drags, maybe they're near Holton or there's some main aspect of it where it's really easy for people to pull in and park their car because they're going to the church next door. When that becomes permit only, then they move to the next block over, right? And so then those group of residents can't park, and then they get permitting, and then it moves to the next block.
But typically, it sounds like it's either near commercial operations or other sort of institutions that would tend to draw large numbers of people, at least at
I think the
times.
events often is a big problem.
Yeah.
And, you know, so that may actually require some real careful
Right.
kind of figuring out about what kind of.
But it sounds like in areas that are
system like that.
kind of much more residential without a lot of commercial or big institutions near there, I don't know if just people haven't wanted them or if there's been less of a pressure on parking, do you think, in those areas?
I think there are different pressures in different
Yeah.
parts of the city. That's certainly true. The permits are all residential zones.
Mhm.
So the question is, what drives that pressure
Right.
in those neighborhoods?
Right.
And as I said, they've kind of evolved over time from about 1985 when council passed the first ordinance. And I think that was oriented around the metro station.
It was during the day, and now evening parking is the bigger issue.
Well,
And so it's a process, and so it does
Right.
depend on residents having, and being organized enough to get the signatures on the petition that they need, knowing how it works and moving it forward.
Yeah.
There is a map online just for people who'd
Yeah.
like to
Right.
check.
But it's also one of those issues that we've talked about with race equity, that is very difficult for apartment building residents to be able to get the kind of signatures that are needed to get something for them.
Right.
And it also doesn't help for temporary parking limitations. So, for example, Tacoma Overlook having construction on their garage means that, you know, their owners can't park in the garage temporarily. They're doing work. So where do they go? And can they park across the street in a residential, you know, in where the single family homes are, if everyone has all of these permit only signs up? And so how would they ever, because they don't have city-owned street parking available to them, qualify under the current system to organize themselves enough to actually identify a street that they could get a permit on? It's not possible. So that's why I do like this idea of, if you live within the city limits, you can get a permit. The streets are the city streets. But I do think, though, that in addition to thinking about where the parking needs are now, it would be helpful to start thinking about where the parking needs will be in the future. The Purple Line, they are not building parking to accommodate the Purple Line. We are working under the assumption that people either bike, walk, take the bus, or perhaps be able to park in some of the commercial spaces that are near the stations. But we don't know how that's going to work. And Montgomery, on the Montgomery County side, they started doing zone parking identification. So that might be something that we want to consider as well, by just making ourselves a zone, which means if people are coming into the area for the purpose of taking the purple line, they wouldn't necessarily clog our streets. So that would just be another thing that we would need to think through in terms of parking downstream.
Yeah, so, and I think one of the challenges is when people come from across town, and we had this with the Area B parking, which got phased out, but people were coming across town for a small number of slots to enable them to park near the metro, but they were, they kind of weren't from that street, so they were blocking driveways and so on, and eventually that was phased out. And around the Presbyterian Church on Tulip, which has so many things going on throughout the day, and especially at the morning and evening drop-off times, it gets very crowded. I mean, what happens in the blocks near there, not just in those drop-off times, but throughout the day, again, for people who don't have driveways, and there are a few near there, or even when they do have driveways, the people literally park, 1 inch from the driveway. It is very problematic. So that's an example of a hotspot that you mentioned. Just a couple of things, a few other things just to run through. Certainly looking at, I don't know that we have to charge the same amount for our meters as DC, but looking if there's some, more regularization that could occur there. And Old Town Business Association is working on this cross-border process with the folks in DC. And one of the issues they're looking at is common signage, maybe for some of these areas that we share. And I don't know if it would work to do something similar where we match up with Prince George's County, but that certainly could work. You mentioned Park Mobile, and I think in the past I was talking about switching to the kiosks so you could fit in more cars as opposed to just having meters. And that's something we're still looking at, but I just tossed that out there.
If I could just
Yeah, sure.
interrupt for a minute. So the Park Mobile idea would not be to have meters or a kiosk, but you'd have a sign.
Mhm.
There'd be signage, and you would
Yeah,
log
okay.
in on your phone to pay your parking at that
Okay,
spot.
so not a separate meter. in
So
other words.
we're not talking
Yeah,
about putting
okay.
meter heads all the way down streets.
So somebody who doesn't have a cell phone with it, can you put money in still, or?
Well, there wouldn't be a meter head, so you'd have to park in the commercial area where there are still meter heads.
Okay. But I thought even there we were gonna shorten them up to allow more cars to fit, or am I
To do
misremembering?
it sort of perpendicularly or angular?
No, just the same way, but just that if you didn't have meters, more cars can fit, because sometimes you
Mhm.
park and there's a lot of extra space. I thought there had been some discussion about how that could add a couple of spaces per area.
Yeah, and on the residential streets, they're not striped
Right.
for cars now at all, so.
So we do want the residential streets striped, as we talked about separately with Darrell Braithwaite, to mark how close people can get to people's driveways.
Just to the driveways, but not,
Yeah.
but
Not,
one of the-
not otherwise, right.
But one of the things I do want to mention is that anytime you identify a number of spaces, either by a meter head
Mhm.
or two lines that say
Mhm.
this is a parking space, then there's a calculation for how many handicap spots have
Yep.
to be and where they are.
Mhm.
When you don't have that, there's more flexibility
Mhm.
about that. So just letting you know that both kinds of ways of delineating parking,
Mhm.
of like either just having on this block or having it by space or by having a meter head, they each have their right place, but you have to look and see what you want.
Well, I have had people suggest that we have one or two additional handicap spots in Old Town, in part because we've lost a couple of spaces due to the cafe situation, so that's something we should look at. I recall earlier, and I don't know if this has been fixed, there's 4 spots right on the edge that are free and don't have anything. Can we just put up some meters there and start making money off of that? I would suggest that.
Been talked about for a long time.
Yeah, I think whoever gets those spots just gets to park there all day for free. You mentioned raising the fees, and maybe the state rules, because the fees have to be relevant to the thing that's being done, right? So does that mean it's harder to charge more for a second car? I mean,
So I have asked the city attorney, and he posed the question more broadly to other municipalities, and everybody seemed to say, hey, we don't know, but when you find out, let us know. The question is that the state of Maryland law requires the cost of the activity or permit to reflect the administrative cost of running that project.
Mhm.
there may be differences in this case, in the way that there are differences in a rec department
Yeah.
class, for instance. You might pay more for some or less for others or something. That it may not be only about the cost of running it, that there, as a fee, there may be a way to look at it more as a consumer good or something that you could,
Okay. Two last things. Whatever we do with the permits, if we continue with the current ones now or have some other version of it, getting to be able to do that online would be one thing. And the last thing is, I agree with several of my colleagues who talked about incentivizing the movement away from cars. That's really got to be something that we talk about as a community and not just kind of do overnight, because you're right, there's 70 or however many years of, in some ways, catering to automobiles. So we can't just say, even if we think that needs to be changed, which I agree that it does, on July 1st, we're going to stop that. So I think it's really important to make sure, especially for those who maybe can't walk or might be limited in their ability to take public transportation, or that there are carpools or ride hailing and all these kinds of things. We need to factor that all in. That's why I think the ad hoc committee might be a good way to ensure that all those strands come together. So thank you.
I'd just like to add that, of course, all of this discussion is about managing the parking we already have. We haven't had a conversation about creating new parking. And so I think it's really important to recognize we are not going to make everyone happy. We're not going to solve all the problems. There will continue to be pressure points. Our goal actually is to figure out some rational way of keeping it moving, using it flexibly, adapting other needs and uses for space as we can. So a chance to kind of look at this whole pot of kettle of fish and see if we can find things that both make sense and that have enough community support to move forward on.
And the last thing, one thing I've seen more and more of, and I don't know if this is doable, but in parking lots, and maybe you can't do it in heavy snow areas, but they're covered with slanted solar panels that sort of shade the cars, but that also allow that space to generate some energy. And I don't know whether there's a way to promote that, not for street parking necessarily, but for big expanses of parking lots. And I have seen some around here, which we do get winter, so I don't know exactly how that would work, but worth looking at too. Thanks.
Councilman Costa, do you have another?
Yeah, I just had one other quick thought. It might be interesting to look into doing some sort of test pilot projects as we're looking to make changes, and just try something out and see what happens for a day or a week. So I hope there'll be opportunities to try that.
Great. All right. Well, I think we've heard. I mean, I guess we could do a show of hands. All those in favor of moving forward with forming an ad hoc parking management committee and exploring how the current Safe Streets committee would interact or be part of this before coming to, I mean, it'll come back to us anyway. But all those in favor, please raise your hand. All right, it's unanimous. Thank you very much for the presentation tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And with that, we are adjourned.